G'day, mate. Luke Ford here, and our guest is Gregory Cochran, the author with Henry Harpending of The 10,000 Year Explosion. This book came out in 2006. Professor Cochran. I'm sorry?
2009.
Oh, my mistake. If you were to revise, update, add material to that book today, what would you do?
Well, the most general thing is, at the time, people were finding evidence that particular variants of certain genes had been selected, did something useful, become more common over the first 1,000 years. And that was true. But there are a lot of other things where it's not a single gene. It's a lot of genes that influence the same trait, let's say height. And many of them have changed in a way that boosts height. That work hadn't been done yet, but it's a big part of what's been driving changes is things that involve many genes, not just one. And if I knew then what I knew now, I would have talked about it more. I knew that happened, but the work hadn't quite been done yet.
What was the most interesting feedback that you received on that book?
People mostly kind of liked it. I had people who said that the thing they regretted most about the book was they hadn't written it themselves. But looking at, say, Amazon reviews and so forth, there was a spectrum for people saying, this is the best book on the subject I've ever read, to, we should release the hounds on this guy. But, you can't please everybody. But on the whole, I think people found it interesting. There were, I think, some points we successfully made. A lot of people have said that, for reasons that kind of escape me, that human evolution came to a stop at some convenient time, and that's not the case. There were some particular predictions we got wrong. There were some we got right. We predicted that we would find that modern humans had mixed with Neanderthals as they expanded into places like Europe. And the year after we published it, that was found. There are other things we were wrong. We were talking about the expansion of the Indo-Europeans, which we now know for sure happened and was important. We were suggesting that it might have been driven by maybe they had high levels of milk tolerance, lactose tolerance, which would make that way of life work better if you can, live off dairy cows out on the prairies. But it wasn't common that early, so it wasn't a major driver. They had it, all right, and they spread it to other places, but they didn't have a whole lot of it. We now know, we're talking 10% of the people having it rather than 50. So it was there, but it wasn't their big advantage in conquering other people. Something else was.
Which people would you most enjoy talking about the themes in your book with?
Living people? People in the past?
No, living people.
Well, they can just read the book, but there are people. I probably talked with quite a few people about it already, people in various areas of genetics and things. There are people that I wish I could talk to, but they're not with us anymore. For example, I had a little bit of interaction with, trying to think of a couple of the guys that I really miss. Bill Hamilton. He was a famous evolutionary geneticist, and he was also very interesting. And he did interact a little with some work I did once upon a time, and I wish I could have been more, because he always had a new angle. He always had a new creative thought on pretty much everything he looked at. But yeah, there are people like that. But in general, I get to talk to people about it, and it's and usually only a few of them have. Usually the people who, for example, wanted to lynch me or something don't end up actually talking to me. And even some of them agree with me, or at least on some parts.
Well, I was trying to find out, who do you respect the most in this field?
Well, respect is a funny thing. I can respect a guy's work, and I may not respect everything he does with it, or I might not respect the fact that certain other things I know he did and, ran off on his wife or whatever. Respect is a combination of things. But there's certainly a number of people I respect pretty well. In a lot of ways, I respect David Reich, even though he doesn't respect me, or at least says he doesn't. I don't know where he really stands exactly. I know, quite a few people that, I've interacted with in genetics. I respect John Hawkes. I've done some work with him, but I also think that he's sharp, knows his stuff. He's a professor at Wisconsin. So there are a number of people, but, again, you have to look at people live their lives in different boxes. There are guys who I have seen do good technical work on a certain issue, and on something else, they appear to have the sense of a goose. And I said, what do I think about people like that? I said, you can rely on them on some things, and other things, they're nuts. That's very common in academia, I think.
I grew up in academia. My father was a professor, and I've often found myself meeting incredibly smart people and wanting that they would be my friends. Do you ever find yourself wanting that some brilliant person be your friend?
Well, usually it's in an area where at least I have an excuse for talking to them, and I have a rule, particularly if they're old. Call them right now. Start talking about something that I want to find out. It's in their field. The great majority of people that I've tried this with are friendly. They're happy that you're interested in their work. It's not hard. Sometimes you become friends, or at least, people that you get along reasonably well, even if you don't know them enough to really call a friend. And partly, I said, I make a rule of, like, if I think of this and the guy is, for example, over 70, I try to call him immediately before he drops dead on me, because I feel really frustrated when I wait. So that's a rule I would recommend to anybody. If there's somebody you think, they can tell you something you need, and you may actually know some, go ahead and talk to him. In my experience, it works fairly easily.
There are a lot of.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Oh, there are a lot of great one-liners in your book. Did they mainly come from you or from Henry, or both?
From me. There would have been more, but the editors said this must stop. But I find it easier to write if I'm allowed to joke at the same time. I can always take out it later if there's too many.
So I got a couple questions for you. I've been asking, I have a lot of friends who study in similar fields, and I've been trying to kind of whittle down what are the best questions. One of them, are Australian Aborigines a separate human species, maybe a holdover from earlier evolutionary branches?
No.
Not at all.
But I can tell you what they are. Okay. Again, some of these things I'm slightly oversimplifying to get it said in less than a half an hour, but modern humans, as we know them, more or less, left Africa about 60 or 70,000 years ago and spread all over Eurasia. Now, the first split is basically between east and west. It's possible to get past the Himalayas, but it certainly isn't easy. And once you have a population on the other side, they don't exchange many people. They start to gradually diverge. So the big split is between, let's say, Iran west and north, and on the other side, India, all the way to China and so forth. These guys were one of the, they were early, but they went through the Middle East. We know that because that's the only way to get out of Africa. And there, at this point, this is the root of all the humans outside of Africa. And then they start going off in different directions. And I said the first split is between east and west. Now, these guys managed to get to Australia, which is something earlier, say Homo erectus, other things had not managed, because you need to do a little bit of boating. You can go from island to island. It was easier then than it is now, because it was in the time of the ice ages, the water level was 300 feet lower. There's a lot of areas in Southeast Asia that are islands today that you could walk to then, but there's still some deep water that's got to be crossed to get to Australia. But if you pick the best path, they still have to go in canoes or something for perhaps a couple of days. So they had to at least be able to do that. It looks like earlier guys couldn't do that. So they apparently got to Australia about 50,000 years ago, and they're different. 50,000 years is time enough for people to be different, but they're not a separate species or anything. Look, there's all sorts of people who are half Australian Aborigine who can testify. It's certainly Ivan Goolagong was half. By the way, I knew some people who were marginally involved professional tennis, and they said she was very unusual for a woman professional tennis player. She was nice.
I got a second question for you, if I could.
Okay.
What do you think of the commonly repeated claim that different ethnic groups of humans could not have evolved differences in intelligence because, as the claim goes, the recent evolution of complex polygenic traits is impossible or unlikely, especially in the brain?
It's false. There's nothing to it at all. Lots of things are affected by many genes. Height, for example, well, groups vary in height. Period. There's nothing hard about it. What this is, like, we have enormous knowledge of breeding for different qualities in domesticated animals, in farm animals. Some of those are complicated. For that matter, you can breed for intelligence in different breeds of dogs, for example, and people do. And on one end, you end up with border collies. The other end, you end up with bloodhounds who are barely capable of, they can sniff things. They're real slow to learn anything. Somebody's made up an imaginary principle to deny a result they don't like. It's 100% false.
And where do you think the myth originated from? From somebody who just was trying to justify his own thoughts?
Sure. I mean, look, quantitative genetic, study of how you select for things and so forth. It's a real field. People do it all the time. It's an industrial field. People know how to do it, and nobody else says it. By the way, in Reich's book, he mentioned somebody trying to give an argument like that, and Reich said, but that's just not true. And he's correct. He said, for example, although Reich, there were a couple of things I quarreled with slightly. Reich was involved in work showing that given reasonably similar amounts to eat, people in Northern Europe are maybe 3 inches taller than people in far Southern Europe. Swedes are a little taller than Sicilians, even when both of them have plenty to eat, which I already knew just looking at people in Chicago. We have both. And Reich criticized somebody for saying, it's especially hard to select for complicated things affected by many genes. And he said, no, it's not. He's absolutely correct. There's no special, when you look at the formulas that people use to estimate how rapid change will be, the number of genes involved doesn't even show up in the formula. When people say this, they're blowing smoke and nothing else.
Interesting.
What are some recent examples of human evolution?
Well, there are actually quite a few. And in some cases, we know even some of the details of how it was happening. In other cases, we just know it happened. Like in tropical jungles, people living there tend to get short. So you have actually two different sets of pygmies in Africa, one more in the Congo, one more to the east in the Ituri forest. Looks like they happen separately. But there are similar people living in jungly areas in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, short, dark people, the Andaman Islands off of India. And I don't think we know exactly why being built and looking this way is the right answer in a jungle, but since it's happened 4 or 5 separate times, we're pretty sure that it is. We know some of the changes involved. Basically, like most people get a growth spurt around puberty, boys especially. Okay, these people don't. There's various changes, some of which we understand, but they make you short. But there are many examples. I mean, one of the famous ones is, this mutation that allows people who have it to digest milk as adults. The default state of humans was to not do this, to sort of turn it off around 6 or so. You could digest it as a little kid, but after a while, you're going on to other things. But there have been several mutations in different areas. These are all people who raise cattle or goats or something. And in those situations, the ability, if needed, to drink milk your whole life was useful. And once the mutation happened, it spread rapidly. So there's a European version, which you see in Europe, but also in North India, of one version that lets people easily digest all the things in milk. There's a couple of separate ones in East Africa among some of the cattle herders. There's a separate one among the Arabs, which is probably for people who domesticated the camel. So there's a change. I mean, my middle boy came up with a nice name for it. Creatures that live off the milk of another species, mampires.
Is there anything that we could point to in the last 500 years that is an example of human evolution?
Well, 500 years, you're going to have less happen than you are in 5,000 years, all else equal. But yeah, there are a couple of things you could mention. Some of them, I think, we probably haven't documented, but they're likely. But I can tell you a couple that are sure. So, for example, American Indians had been isolated, or pretty much isolated. Maybe the occasional random fisherman, but pretty much isolated for 15,000 years. Where in the rest of the world, all sorts of new diseases are arising, and people are getting hardened to those diseases or evolving defenses, etc. The American Indians didn't. So after they get contacted, they're in deep, deep, deep trouble. Not just one new thing, not just two, but it's more like 10. So it's not just smallpox, and it's not just the bubonic plague, and it's not just measles, just not malaria. It's all of the above, depending on the local climate a little bit. Not everywhere got malaria if you're dry enough. But I've estimated probably killed off 90% of the American Indians. And this is mostly just, if you land, it's going to happen. If the Spanish had 2 trading posts and never conquered anything, most of this would have happened anyhow. But the point is, some Indians were more vulnerable than others. There were genetic differences. Indians are different now. They're not as vulnerable as they were 500. The ones that are left are the ones that are left. Now, there's another factor, which is mixing with the Spanish, mixing with the Portuguese, mixing with somebody else. All those other people are tougher against it. So if you have somebody who's, the father's a conquistador, the mother's an Indian, the kids have one advantage. They're less likely to die.
Can you anticipate evolutionary changes from the explosion in the use of technology such as iPhones?
No, I don't know any particular thing out of that. I could tell you some general trends that are happening right now. Like right now, you look at those things that are linked to intelligence, they're getting less common rapidly. Probably at the rate of about an IQ point a generation. And this is not counting immigration or movement of peoples. This is just among one group of people just sitting there. What the reason is because highly educated women don't have many kids. So in every population that I know of, the genetic potential for IQ is dropping.
What can societies do to increase the general IQ other than importing high IQ individuals?
Well, generally they react by importing low IQ individuals, which is not actually the best possible strategy. What could they do? Well, they could forbid women to get technical jobs. They could forbid them to go to college. They could have really heavy subsidies for having extra kids. By the way, many countries have tried that. It usually doesn't work. What I think would be most effective is, there's all kinds of stupid things people do, or smart things, but they don't do them because they're stupid or smart. They do them because they're in fashion. So if you could, bribe all the right people who are good at controlling what's considered fashionable, you could get Chinese women to bind their own feet. I mean, they did, right? People would worry if their daughters' feet weren't bound, even though that, cripples you after a while, because it was fashion. I think it might be possible to have fashion say, have 3 kids. But it doesn't right now. It says the opposite. But it's easier to influence his behavior through irrational means than by persuasion.
What did you think of J. Philippe Rushton?
Met him once or twice. Most of the stuff in his book talking about racial differences is correct. As for his attempts at a theoretical explanation of it, they didn't convince me, partly because I can think of 8 or 9 more. We will know more about the causes of these things, but we're going to dig it out of the genetics. If there's many possible explanations, it's premature to pick any particular one of them and say, this must be the real explanation.
Here is a quote from Phil Rushton at a American Renaissance conference. He said, Joseph Goebbels had complete control of the media in Germany, and the German birth rate shot up, and German nationalism shot up, and ethnic solidarity increased, and out-group hatred increased. The reason was because of the images displayed. If you saw today on television lots and lots of nice blue-eyed blonde babies being born, and women who had lots of these babies being happy having babies and wanting to stay home and not to work, then you would increase the number of women who would want to have babies and stay at home. Do you think Rushton was right about this?
I think he's right that, the general spirit of the times, the Weltanschauung, the, faddishness can influence things. Like the idea, did the birth rate go up in Germany? I said, well, I don't think it did in 1941, 1942, 1943, 1945, if only because there's 10 million German men off occupying other countries. Could it have gone up in 1935? Maybe. I don't know the numbers. But I know he's wrong, at least about half of what he's talking. The other thing is the whole strategy, which involves getting Germany blown to pieces, leveled, and occupied by the Red Army, has to be considered to have some flaws. But can you influence people by the general tenor of attitudes? I said it happens. You can get people to believe ridiculous things, apparently. Maybe you could even get people to do something reasonable. We can dream.
I mean, if you look at the Orthodox Jewish community, though, reading is not only encouraged, it's considered, the person who has the most kids is the most socially acceptable amongst the group.
Yeah, well, I mean, but they're an example, and there are others. Amish have no trouble. They feel perfectly comfortable having a bunch of kids. Now, you need the right economics to make this possible. There has to be somewhere for people to go, jobs to take, and so forth. And that can be a problem, and it's a problem for some of the Orthodox, too. But the problem is it is a state of mind as much as anything else. I mean, in real senses, people are pretty prosperous in this country. They could afford more kids. They just don't. They make different choices. But, can social attitudes affect choices? Sure. Now, I don't know how easy it is to shape them deliberately, but it's probably somewhat possible.
So if you were the dictator of the United States, would you mandate a eugenics program? And if so, can you elaborate beyond what you've already described?
Well, I would spend an awful lot of my time as dictator saying, how am I doing? I kind of doubt the basic strategy of being a dictator, and it's quite possible that even if you did, I might not be the best possible guy. But if I was, what I would do is try to make it seem cool rather than forcing anybody to do anything. If at least I give it a try. So, for example, I'd show off my kids. I said, of course, I tell them to be on their damn best behavior if they're going to show up and be seen and try to be a positive force. But it strikes me that, again, if you can get people to think that what you do is cool, you're more than halfway there. I mean, assuming that you're an example rather than you're a good example rather than a horrible example.
But why not just sterilize everyone with an IQ under 95?
I don't like pushing people around and hurting them. Call it a preference.
A small preference, So obviously, this is going to come up, that your work on describing homosexuality as gene-related, and a secondary one is deviant sexuality, the result of a damaged endocrine system from trauma in the womb.
Well, I'm actually not arguing it's gene-related.
Oh, okay. I was misinformed then.
Yeah, well, one of the basic facts is that identical twins, if one is gay, the other is 75% chance he's not. The concordance is not incredibly high. It's higher for a lot of other things. I mean, but the question is, we have two people, they're genetically identical. One is gay, the other is not most of the time. Some non-genetic factor has to explain the difference. What is it? Nobody knows. My suggestion, which was, again, talking with some evolutionary biologists, was when you find something that's real common and real destructive in a reproductive sense, which this is, the average number of kids a gay guy has is not very high, that it should be rare. But it's not all that rare. It's, a few percent. And so the suggestion I had is, well, I can tell you times in which people would find a village in Africa and half the people were blind by the age of 40. And what was the reason? Was it bad genetics? Was it self-abuse? No. It was a particular local disease, river blindness. When something's really bad and really common, it's reasonable to consider the possibility that it's somehow caused by a pathogen. For example, it can be in odd ways. Like recently, you've probably heard of mononucleosis.
Yes,
of course.
Okay, yeah. All right, caused by a virus called EpsteinBarr, and almost everybody gets it after a while. But it turns out, in the long run, it increased your risk of several bad things. A lot of autoimmune disorders, things like lupus. It's apparently almost impossible to get lupus if you haven't first had EpsteinBarr, it's almost impossible. Like, there are certain kinds of lymphoma that become much more, I mean, they're not real common, but they're more common if you've had it. There's a couple of obscure things, something common in South China called nasopharyngeal cancer. Again, you got to have Epstein-Barr first before it does it. There's, anyhow, there's a number of things which this somehow opens the door to. Which, and by the way, people are thinking more and more seriously about inoculating everybody against this. But the point is, it's caused by a bug, but in a complicated and obscure, slow way. I think there's more things like that. Like, one of the ones that you at least remember the truth emerging on was stomach ulcers.
Mm-hmm. I remember that.
Everybody talked about, it's caused by stress. That was the problem with that explanation. It was completely untrue. What it was caused, there was a type of stomach bacteria which many people had. Some of the people who had it went on to ulcers. Not everybody, but basically you seldom or never got ulcers without that bacterium. And the point is, if you're saying, well, why would people have ulcers? People have had stomachs for hundreds of millions of years. Haven't we got this right yet? And the answer is, well, that we kind of have, but with the right bug in there, it messes things up. So I and some other people think there's a reasonable chance it's either a bug that we know but don't know all the things it does, or perhaps an unknown bug could be involved in doing something to the brain that causes homosexuality. At any rate, certainly something causes it. But we'll see. By the way, we'll see probably when somebody looks, which could easily be 1,000 years at the current rate. This is hard for people to investigate if they're thinking of their careers.
So you published a famous essay in 2005, I believe, with Henry Harpending about Ashkenazi intelligence, and then you wrote about it as well in your 2009 book, The 10,000-Year Explosion. Is there anything that you'd like to revise or update in your writing on Ashkenazi IQ?
Some, not a whole lot. We know more about the formation of the Ashkenazi Jews. We know more about their ancestors. At the time, we knew some. And what I was thinking was not incredibly different, what turns out to be the truth. But you don't have to guess on a lot of these things now. So the formation is a part of the story. Like, we now know that there were some guys from the Middle East, presumably Jewish, though we don't actually know that, who moved probably to Italy. Probably some sort of traders. And this is kind of late, call it 800, 900 AD. And they picked up Italian wives. And then they moved to a place where there was a lot of new business up in the Emperor of Charlemagne's, up in northern France, the Rhineland, that area. And that's where the Ashkenazi Jews started. And originally they were probably about half Middle Eastern and about half Italian. And essentially all the Italian is on the mother's side. And then they got kicked out of there eventually. They also expanded they were more in Germany, more in France, in England for a while. And they mixed a little bit more with the people around. Not a lot, but a little. They picked up a little bit of French ancestry, maybe 8%. And then later, they got expelled from Western Europe and moved mostly to Poland. Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth. And there, they mixed a little too, but not much. You can see maybe 8% Slavic ancestry. So the total ancestry today is about 60% European, 40% Middle Eastern. On the mother's side, it's 90% European. We have some decent estimates on the dates of all of these things. We didn't know all that back in 2009. Now we do.
So are we seeing already a decline in Ashkenazi average IQ as Ashkenazi Jews in the United States, for example, are outmarrying at about 60%?
Probably. I haven't seen the numbers, but it's kind of an inevitable consequence. I mean, at the peak, you went a long time with, again, the way this works is if you have a society such that the smarter people outbreed the average people and the lower doesn't have to be a lot, a little. It adds up over generations. So, for example, imagine a society where the people having the kids in the next generation are a full 1 IQ point higher than a random draw. That's enough if you then do it for 1,000 years, because you'll increase about half a point a generation. and that's about 40 generations. In fact, that's more than enough because it didn't increase that much. But, that's the kind of estimate it is. And I claim it while it was happening, you would barely even notice it was happening. One point, but the reason I think it happened is because you had a different kind of job mix. The Ashkenazi Jews were essentially the only people in the world that during this period were all doing, by all, I mean 90% of them, doing various white-collar jobs. In the early days, they were doing something we call money lending, which was sort of a slash between being a banker and being a pawnbroker. Later, in Poland, they did things like being tax farmers, things like running a mint, things like doing the books for the tax farmer, things like running a bar, things like, various kinds of businesses. Few of them farmed, almost none. Few of them, now this changed eventually, but first not too many were doing crafts. But that changed in Poland because they were making more money than the average Polish peasant, their numbers increased relative to the average Polish peasant. Like in 1500, there were 1% of the population of Poland. In 1900, there were 10% of the population of Poland. You start running out of management jobs. So as there got to be more Jews, more of them start doing things like, well, they might be a peddler with a backpack. They might be, they might make leather goods. They might make shoes. So these changed a little over time. But for probably 800 years, they were almost entirely doing white-collar jobs. And although there are other people in the world like this, those were all parts of larger groups that mostly farmed. So if you had a guy in London who was doing some sort of merchant, but he might very well marry somebody who was a farmer, and those farm families were under different selective pressures, not exactly the same. And so whatever's happening to him, it's getting diluted by what's happening to the 90% of Englishmen that were farmers. The Ashkenazi, almost none of them were farmers. By the way, I have had professional evolutionary biologists say, well, but I thought most Ashkenazi Jews were farmers. I've had Jewish evolutionary biologists tell me that. I said, let me guess. Where did you get that idea? Okay, you watch Fiddler on the Roof, right? He said, well, yeah, that is where I got it. And I said, well, I cheated. I read lots of medieval Jewish history. It's not the same thing. I mean, I read it to the point where I never want to read another piece of medieval Jewish history in my life. But I said, that's what these guys did. And that's what's different from, you can't find anybody else. Like, even if you look at Jews, say, in the Islamic countries, they didn't all have white-collar jobs. They did, they were more likely to be a shoemaker or a tanner or, there were places in which they were kind of sat on and they got crappy jobs, like in Morocco. Like one common Jewish job, particularly in the later days as the Arab world was started declining, was collecting crap and drying it out for people to burn, or being an executioner, which is not probably your ideal white-collar job, or, just miscellaneous stuff, with a spectrum, but kind of on the lower end, at least in a lot of places like Yemen and Morocco. Again, every one of these Jewish groups is somewhat different. They all have some ancestry from the Middle East, but from the women, they almost all seem to have picked up local wives. Mm-hmm. So you can find little Jewish groups in India. They look pretty much Indian. And you do the genetics on the mother side, they're entirely Indian. And they have a story that they had a ship went aground here, more than 1,000 years ago. It's quite possibly accurate. It's quite possibly so. And of course, the other thing is, if you're in India, whatever you do, you become a caste, whether you ask to or not. You could be anybody, and you would say, "Oh, they're the such and such caste. They do this particular job." That's India. Just everybody falls into a slot like that, whether they mean to or not. But anyhow, the Ashkenazi. Again, one of the interesting things is they're mostly not Jewish. I've been trying to tell them what they should do is reconquer Italy, because it's much nicer than Palestine. Just look at it. Tuscany. Wouldn't you rather live in a place where it rains? And I said, and it can't be that hard because all you have to do is beat Italians. It's nearly as easy as fighting Arabs. But I haven't sold this idea yet. At any rate, but
I had written a paper years ago about something my grandmother always used to say. And I know that you see this differently, or at least you've written about this differently, but I had called it eugenic breeding, in that when you have so many instances of wholesale slaughter of Jewish communities throughout Europe, that the smarter ones tended to get out. You know,
I know that idea, but I don't think, according to that, gypsies should be even smarter. But they're not. Well, let me explain. There is a sense in which it helped. Like I mentioned that with Poland and so forth, eventually, if Jews were increasing numbers, eventually they start going into other more mundane jobs because they have to. Okay. One of the things that kept that from happening as much, very much, particularly in Western Europe, is they had enough persecution that it kept their numbers from getting super high. So they could stay specialized in white-collar jobs. If there had been, suppose there had been 1 million Jews in Western Europe instead of 100,000 in, say, 1,200, they would have had to start doing other things. The evolutionary pressures would have been different. But anyhow, I can think of guys who were smart enough to dodge the bullet in World War II. But I can also think of like John von Neumann was smart enough to say, crap is coming down. Terrible stuff is going to happen. I want to get out of Germany. And he did it in 1933. But few people, I said, well, fuck, John von Neumann is possibly the smartest guy who ever lived. How much difference does it make for most people? The answer is most people apparently can't see it coming. I would argue that, we know that in the Ashkenazi communities, I know this better in Poland because it's better documented later, but the guys who had more money raised more kids. They didn't do anything to interrupt their fertility. They had more money, they raised more kids. And they could take care of more. Like anybody can have 8 kids. The question is, can you feed 8 kids? Mm-hmm. And if you have more money, and there's a few other positive things you can do. You can hire a wet nurse if you need one. There were people who had a house in the country, so if there's an epidemic running through town, you go out and you hide. Famine. Like when famine came, if you had money, the famine happens every now and then in places like Europe in the past. It's not mystical or it really happened. I mean, like as late as like in the last years of the Sun King in France, 1720 or so, they had a famine that killed 10% of everybody in France. And that was one of the minor ones. These things happened, but they didn't happen if you had money. So Jews were always threatened with persecution, but at least to the extent they stayed in their niche where they're, white collar, making more money than a peasant, they never starved. That's a sort of a compensating advantage.
What's your understanding of the Holocaust? What explains it?
As much as anything else, Adolf Hitler. I mean, if Adolf Hitler had taken over Germany and he didn't feel like doing it, it wouldn't have happened. But, there are strains, there are reasons for people liking and disliking Jews. If you go back a few hundred years, in Poland and the Ukraine by this time, the Jews were the middlemen minority in they worked for the nobles and the peasants worked for them, roughly speaking. That meant the peasants didn't like them. Period. They're not, particularly the Ukrainians, for whom it was kind of a new thing. They had been acquired by Poland kind of recently, and they got to the point where they hated each other. Particularly, I think the peasants hating them. And then after the big rebellion of 1648, the Jews hated them right back. Traditionally, again, there are human motives for some of these things. That doesn't justify anything, but it's, there's reasons. Like, why are people who loan out a lot of money on people's shit list? I said, I don't know, but it's always true. I said, like people said, hey, if I kill so-and-so, who I owe a lot of money to, I won't owe the money anymore, right? That happened. That happened in Western Europe. Sometimes it was religious. Sometimes it's just they consider themselves different, and therefore, pure difference is a reason. It makes it easier for friction to happen. Like one thing that shrinks friction is said, well, but he is my brother-in-law, and my sister would be all upset. Well, in most of the Middle Ages, that almost never happened. Today, it happens all the time. The groups didn't intermarry very much. Like when I say you got a little bit of admixture after living in some place for 200 years, that doesn't mean there's very much in any given generation. And it doesn't mean it's very formal. Like, how do I think that Polish genes ended up in the Ashkenazi community? I said, well, sometimes you have some Jewish guy. He's in a new town. There's only a few Jews there. he falls in love with somebody, and even though the rules are kind of against it, he marries her anyhow, and he manages to find a way to make it legal later. Okay, that's what happened with this original group, picking up Italian wives. They weren't Jewish Italians. They were just Italians. There were hardly any Jewish Italians to find. At any rate, so anyhow, there are reasons, but a lot of it boils down to one guy's psychopathy and ending up in power. There are weird things that happened in Russia because Stalin was the dictator. If there was a particular subject or particular group Stalin didn't give a crap about, history would have been different.
You think Hitler would have won World War II if he'd followed the advice of his generals and marched on Moscow in June of 1941?
You're going to regret asking me that because I've wargamed that 1,000 times. Probably not. The fundamental problem, if this starts turning into a grognard contest, that would just be wrong. But anyhow, yes, I'll do it. Probably not. The problem was the logistics were very impossible. You have to keep a constant flow of gasoline and ammunition and food to these guys. And it got harder and harder the farther they were into Russia. And for the Russians, if anything, it's getting easier because a lot of their main rail lines are sort of going roughly north-south through Moscow. They retreat to Moscow. They're getting close to their supplies. The Germans are getting farther from theirs. And the only way the Germans could fix this is the Russians had built railroads that you could not run a German locomotive on. The rails had a different gauge. They were too wide. This was policy. Even the Tsar said, Germans, can't trust them. So they had to remodel the railroads before they could get good supplies. It took time. It took longer than they had before winter came. So...
Yeah, but Hitler went south. If he'd gone through Army Group Center to Moscow, he would have disrupted the whole supply chain for the Soviet Union. If he stayed to Moscow,
he had to have a supply chain of his own too. That's not so easy to do. I mean, he was about at the limit of how far, they were rebuilding the railroads behind them, but only so fast. Also, if you had done nothing in the South, instead of capturing those million guys in Kiev, they still would have been around. They could have attacked your flank. If I was trying to give Hitler advice other than kill yourself, I would, if there was some reason we wanted him to win, I'll tell you what would have had a better chance, in my view. The Germans had nerve gas and nobody else did. They never used it during the war, partly because they mistakenly thought everybody else knew how. Partly because one of the key papers had been published in the open literature. They assumed everybody had read it. They were wrong. Okay. Nerve gas is more potent per pound than high explosives by about 30 times. Mm-hmm. So they were making air raids on Moscow. But if they'd made an air raid that was 30 times, that hit 30 times harder, I don't know if there would have been a Moscow. So there are options that are at least conceivable they might have done. But in general, they were looking to do something that was too big for their strength. Hitler... he's not happy with just finding England without figuring out a way to win. He says, well, maybe it'll be easier if I also add another country which is essentially about as strong as mine, less industry but more manpower. And says, and then to top it off, because, I want a clean sweep, I now have to declare war on the United States, which is potentially the most powerful country in the world. I've heard people talk about this 6-month period in which he adds Russia and the United States to his enemies. And he says it defies analysis. It's one of the craziest things anybody ever did. There's no way to win once you're fighting England, Russia, and the United States. Altogether, their total power potential is at least 5 times bigger than his. It's amazing he got as far as he did.
Vice President Joseph Biden in 2014 said that what affects movements in America, what affects our attitudes, are as much culture and arts as anything else. Says on gay marriage, it wasn't anything we legislatively did. It was will and grace. It was the social media. And behind all of that, I bet you 85% of those changes, whether it's in Hollywood or social media, are a consequence of Jewish leaders. Do you think that Jewish leadership is the primary force behind social change in the United States?
Some of it. I don't know how right he was. I probably don't know enough about the personnel in this, although it does sound like Biden is, clearly giving this speech at an AmRand conference. But, he's got depths. It's true that on the whole, American Jews have voted very much left of where you'd think of considering their economic position. It's been said, they make money like Episcopalians and they vote like Puerto Ricans. And that's true. And do I think that on the whole their political judgment has been particularly sound? No. I mean, when there was a way to be wrong, they've been wrong disproportionately, I think. Of course, maybe my politics is wrong. I don't know. But in many cases, there were measurable things, ways in which we could finally answer a certain question one way or the other. And there should be more of those. Those are good things. Like, were most Jews pro-communist? No, but a higher fraction than in other groups was. Okay, particularly in, 30s, 40s, but even later. I said, well, did communism turn out to be all that wonderful a system? I'd say no. Or cultural things like Freud was Jewish, and many of his supporters and people interested in psychotherapy were Jewish. I said, do I think there was any? Was this a step forward in understanding the human mind? Do I think that Freudian psychotherapy was progress in scientific psychology? I said, no, I think it was complete nonsense. But it prospered for quite a while. For about 50 years, it sort of dominated. Like the average hospital, they'd have a psychiatric unit and Freudians would be running it. The problem was they weren't any good at fixing anything. Well, of course, in a sense, this is traditional. It used to be all doctors were no good at fixing anything. In the not-so-distant past, I've seen estimates that the time which doctors finally got into the black, where they were curing more people than they killed, was as late as the 1930s. Lots of the things they routinely did for literally hundreds and thousands of years greatly increased your chance of dying. You were a lot safer if you never went to a doctor at all in 1800. Like what happened to George Washington. Bleed him again. Let's bleed him again. I think they took more than a gallon from him before he died. But psychology, so I don't think psychology is in great shape today, but Freudianism was a step backward.
So by and large, in your lifetime, have you noticed the Jewish community moving the United States of America in a direction that you like or in a direction that you don't like?
Well, they're not the sole movers. I mean, almost everything, you have to have other people agree with you to get things done. You're not winning an election with 2.5% of the vote. But look, I'm an old-fashioned Republican most of the way. Do I like most of the things they've engineered? I said, generally not much. And there have been times in which, again, even for practical reasons, like, a Jewish girl who spent, who kept going to a psychiatrist until she ran out of money, wasn't benefited. I mean, mistakes are not just to other people, mistakes are to yourself as well. Or let's suppose that on the whole, not just them, but more than you'd think from their numbers, they were involved in pushing certain kinds of feminism. Well, how happy was Shulamith Firestone over her whole life? Of course, she's a lousy example because she was schizophrenic, but, how did it actually work? I know people said, well, I never really intended to have any children, but I sure liked it after I did. And I think that to the extent that anybody was influenced by some of these things, I think a lot of times they kind of regretted it. But hey, I'm not them. I can't read all their minds. I don't know for sure. I mean, there's certainly some positive things in things like the exact sciences. Jews have done disproportionately useful things.
So in culture and politics, Jews have been more a force for ill than for good in the United States.
Not disastrously, but I think I probably, on the whole, haven't really liked. I mean, like, who do I vote for? I said the other guy, usually. It's not like saying they're the Mongols. I said, but to the extent that they don't push in the direction I would push.
So do their accomplishment in the exact sciences outweigh the harm that they've done in politics and culture?
Well, I mean, I don't know that many of the same things wouldn't have happened anyhow. As I said, you have to push a door that's open. When you're 2% of the population, you can't make everybody do things. So who knows? A lot of these things might have happened anyhow. I don't know. But do they outweigh? Hell, I don't know. It's like something that Chu Enlai supposedly said when people asked him about the French Revolution. It's a good thing or a bad thing. He said, it's too early to tell.
Well, but do you have any trepidation as coming out as slightly skeptical or slightly negative towards Jews?
Well, I don't care. I'm not worried about it.
So it's not like what you're really thinking in your head is different than what you're telling us, that they basically match up.
Pretty near. I mean, it doesn't mean that they may not be my personal friends. It may not mean that I can think of times in which, on the whole, they did very useful things or pushed in a useful direction. But I mean, I can think of times in which they were correctly more sensitive to Hitler than a lot of other people. But they were also less sensitive to Stalin than a lot of other people on average. I remember an old boss of mine who was himself Jewish, and he said, well, there's a spectrum. He grew up in New York, and he talked about guys he knew who lived in co-ops and were raised singing Red Army songs. And he thought that was pretty stupid, and I agreed with him. Again, that's the edge of the distribution. That's the kind of sort of people who voted for Henry Wallace or something. But there were more of them than in some other populations. On the other hand, very few joined the German-American Bund.
For example, every single major American Jewish organization supports immigration amnesty. Is that something that's in your interests?
Probably not, but it's not in theirs either. As I said, a lot of these things, it isn't like when you do things that are just mistakes usually bite in every direction. Again, I was talking about Freudian analysis. One simple model of what often happened is you'd have an analyst, he'd find young women who had some money and were romantically somewhat disappointed, and he would see her and screw her and take her money until she ran out. Now, was this a positive thing for the Jewish community? I said, probably not. Is bringing in, depends where people, there are people that would be neutral as far as the Jews are concerned. I said, is the Arab world such a place? No. You're bringing in people who aren't going to like you. I said, no, I don't know why this is a secret. That it's pretty obvious, and it certainly has happened at a greater scale in Europe. Now, maybe I'm wrong. I would guess for a long time Jews in France supported this, and some of those same people are now leaving France because of it. Would that be an unrealistic view?
No, that's very realistic. So some people.
Well, but that's goofy. France is a pretty place. It would be better to stay there if you could. I don't know why people do half the things they do. I mean, if I want, I could start. The whole human race has a pretty high dose of foolishness. But why do they do that? I mean, I can sort of imagine some of the reasons why, but, like in Israel, for example, when, after 48, Jews were being expelled, sort of retaliatory, from many Arab countries. Okay, and Ashkenazi Jews were the original founders of the state, mostly. And they said, well, but, if they're here and they come to Israel, they go to our schools, certainly by the next generation, everything, they'll catch up because everybody has the same capabilities. I said, well, Ashkenazi Jews are prone to thinking that, but I cannot think of the last time they ever turned out to be right. For example, they said, well, the Yemenis, they'll do just as well. I said, but they don't. Or the Falasha, they'll do just as well. I said, but they don't.
They still aren't 50 years later.
Well, the Falasha haven't been there quite that long, but yeah.
No, I meant the Yemenites.
Oh, yeah. No, I know that. I know all these statistics. I've looked at it. There are people in Israel, but there was an Israeli evolutionary biologist who was interested in, our model. And by the way, there is one alternate model that isn't too different that I should mention. My model with the Ashkenazi Jews is they were doing an unusual class of jobs. The people who did better had more kids, and it gradually changed them. Okay? All right. Now, there is an alternate model, which is not incredibly different, except my model doesn't involve anybody planning or deciding anything. It's just if you make more money, you have more food. you can take better care of the kids, period. And I've also found a fair amount of records and mentions that say, and the rich people did have more kids. Like the average number might be 2.5 or 3. I mean, the population was growing, but not incredibly fast. Okay. Well, what about the rich, famous people? I said, they might have 6. I said, so there is some knowledge about the differences. But the alternative theory is that the best Talmudists were highly rewarded. Rich people would try to marry their daughters off to the best Talmudists, and we were selecting for a Talmudic type expertise. I said, if that's really what happened, it's not inconceivable. Can I find any evidence much that it happened? When I find a famous Talmudist, he usually marries his daughter off to his best pupil, who's just as poor as he is. I mean, for the first 500 years or so, they didn't even pay rabbis. You had to have a regular job.
But if you read into the stories of most of the highest level Talmudists, they would say, and then he became wealthy, or he inherited a fortune and was a rich man. Like
some of them were usually rich in the first place, but anyhow, the real emphasis on Talmudic schools and stuff is a later development. It's like 1700s and later. People weren't doing it in the year 1200. They weren't doing it in the year 1000. I mean, there were Talmudists, but they run a vineyard or something. They had a job. They weren't paid a regular salary. Not yet. That came later. Again, that's what my reading of history tells me. Maybe they're mistaken. I'm not mistaken. I'm just repeating what they said. But could it be true? I said it could. And if you had a rule like that, and being good at a Talmudic analysis was demanding enough upon intelligence, and then on average it led to more kids, it could work. But my bet is on wealth selection because no one has to try. If you're talking about a long-term trend, it's easier if it just happens naturally rather than constantly, remember, you have to marry this person you don't like because he's a great Talmudist. And as opposed to, you have to marry this guy, but of course you got to realize he's got a nice house and he's really got the money coming in. I don't know. That sounds kind of repulsive. I'm just saying, by the way, I don't rule out the Talmudic analysis bit, but I can't find the evidence, as I see it, more inclines to just being good at your job and succeeding. But it could also be a mix of both. But I'm just saying, I'm aware of both of those possibilities. But to make any of this work, you have certain preconditions, and the Ashkenazi Jews in Europe had them. You need to have low intermarriage rate. Absolutely essential. It doesn't matter what you start with too much, but after you start going, you can't mix very much, or you end up like the guy across the street. It's easy to be like other people. Just intermarry with them a little bit. But any rate, what was the last question again?
What's your Christian denomination?
Methodist.
And I believe you're a religious man, so what does religiosity mean to you?
Probably something complicated I don't actually feel like discussing here. But it means something to me.
Would you feel comfortable describing how it affects your thinking or your values or the way you view the world?
A little bit. I would say it says, people are not something you just use. People are something that have their own value. You should, propose solutions that involve sterilizing a lot of people, I will reject. I want to try to treat people decently. I think people have a value in themselves. Hard as it can be to believe it when they're sitting you on your chest and punching you in the face. All of those things happen, but I think people, hopefully, possibly as a matter of faith rather than practical evidence, are worth something.
Have you had any struggles with the rationality of your own religion, or is that just a separate sphere that you don't rationally investigate?
I haven't had much struggle with it.
And have you been a lifelong Christian?
Yeah.
Have you had any experience like debating with creationists where it gets like real heated?
Only a tiny bit. And then, the point is, like, I think they're mistaken, but I have no real feeling like they must be crushed as a menace to society. So if somebody, and I'm thinking of a certain husband of a cousin of ours who started saying, well, you must think X because I said, I've never said anything about it. What do you know what I think? But then I tried to be polite to him because I like his wife. And I don't really disapprove of him, even if I think he's a fruitcake. You can be a fruitcake without being a bad guy. So, I haven't had many arguments. And I don't actually think of it as all that useful a subject to sit around and argue people with. Of course, there are times I wonder if there's any subject that's actually, because actually changing somebody's mind is one of the rarest human things. I've done it once or twice, and I was astonished.
I almost never meet Christians who want a Christian United States, and to me that just seems weak. Like, how exactly is it in your interest as a Christian to have competing religions around, and I just don't see what's in it for you.
Probably nothing. But that doesn't mean I want to shoot anybody who's already here.
Right, but why would you want to give up your country to other religions? I don't get it.
Who said I did?
Well, I'm asking you, do you want to keep giving up? Because your co-religionists have very happily given away sovereignty of their own country.
Yeah, well, they've been screwy for years. I mean, who knows what has to be done about it. I remember reading Sunday school articles in the 60s about, it was titled, Christians and Communists Are Talking, both driven by the same love of their neighbor. And I said, Jesus Christ, you're talking about people who massacre priests in the Ukraine, who shoot Lithuanian Christian girls, who blow up churches. I said, I knew the story in Eastern Europe and Russia. I said, what's wrong with this person? I said, I don't know, but I'm sure that Hillary Clinton was reading that same article, and I think she reacted differently than me.
Why did the WASP lose its will to rule? 100 years ago, WASPs ruled the world. Now they have no interest in retaining sovereignty of the countries they created. What the heck's going on?
I don't pretend to understand those people. I'm not sure I'm really one of them. I probably am closer to Scotch-Irish. And I've never given up the impulse to fight anything, even things that don't need to be fought.
But you've observed that 100 years ago, WASP ruled the world. The last 100 years, they gave up that desire. What the heck happened?
Good question. You tell me. I know many things.
I'll tell you. Then I'll very humbly propose a theory and allow you to rip it to shreds. WASPs have a universal morality, and so they are not cut out for between-group competition. So as soon as they started allowing in groups to practice dual morality, they were allowing in their conquerors.
I don't see anything particularly difficult about realizing that when you try to apply rules to certain people who aren't going to respect them, is said, make a note. All right, they don't. Now let's have a new strategy against them. I don't see anything very complicated about this, but I've said that about so many things. I said, I don't think there's any particularly difficulty of watching what happens and adjusting your behavior to the way things actually are.
But WASPs haven't done that. They will not give up their universal morality, even if it means their extinction.
Well, that would be a mistake, wouldn't it? There are things I feel I understand, and there are things I feel I don't, and this is one of the second. I don't know why people do the things they do in this direction.
So Alternative Hypothesis had a real interesting kind of take on this, where he said individualism and libertarianism are basically the definition of white nationalism, because whites are one of the few groups who doesn't have a cohesive community stand on most things. Like, they have different religions, they have different goals and objectives, and the individualism that they are so proud of is also their undoing, because they don't vote as a block, they don't move as a block, they don't.
They're coming closer.
So that was I'm probably not doing it as much justice as I could, but that was a video he had put out, and I'd found that very interesting.
Well, if everyone else is playing identity politics, Dr. Cochran, why shouldn't white people?
It's not in their nature, is what he was basically saying.
Oh, I'm not convinced of that, but I also think it's certainly one of the more boring games for anybody to play, even though it might sometimes be necessary. But boring, yes, really, really boring. I used to keep track. There used to be things like, there was a special little magazine that explained of every invention and discovery in time, that there was really an Irishman at the back of it. And, it was always really Patty who had discovered gravity and crossed the Atlantic and blah, 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 blah. And, it was funny for a while. Then afterwards, it was just boring. It's boring when the Russians do it. It's boring when anybody does it. The real, actually trying to understand how things click is more interesting to me, at least.
Well, what happens when, let's say, I think your view is generally true for European descended people. Now they come into competition with people who don't find identity politics boring. So who's going to win that fight?
Time will tell. I don't know. But I know it's perfectly, look, any of these things can be reversed in a second because, what would happen if the French said, okay, we're going to expel Group X? I said, then they would. There's nothing to stop it from happening. It's happened before. More than once.
And what do you think of the chances that European-based peoples will take back sovereignty of the countries they created?
I don't know.
I was having this argument with someone the other day where I said, in America, it's much more likely that you would have a civic nationalism revolt before you would have an ethnic nationalism revolt, because ethnic politics has not been woven into the fabric of America, as it was always considered like a melting pot of different European cultures. So you'd be more likely to see an American rising up of the American right wing than you would more of an ethnically based kind of.
If you think of people, like on the census, there's a fair number of people when they're asked their ethnic group, they say American, which usually means, by the way, English, European descended groups, typically in the South and border regions. But yeah, you can imagine a situation where more people like that. But these things are hard to predict. There's certain things I feel I can predict. Often it means somebody's doing some really complicated Rube Goldberg a try at something, and I say, well, that won't work. And I can predict those with pretty good accuracy. But, what will history bring us? Hard to say. I mean, did you guys see Trump coming, say, 2 years ago? Well, I didn't. But did I see that the Republican Party wasn't offering the average voter very much, whereas the Democratic Party was offering them something closer to hostility? I said, yeah, I knew that. But, it's hard to see how it's going to play out. And I don't think Trump saw it. Trump thought he had a chance, but he didn't think he had an overwhelming chance. I saw somebody interviewing him, and he said, I thought I might have a 15% chance or something, which is, being rational about it, actually. I mean, nobody, only a few people have, 90% chances. It's rare.
America's average IQ is rapidly declining as the less intelligent people have far more children than intelligent people. What do you see as the trajectory for the United States of America? Are we headed for a Brazil-type situation?
There are two things going on. One is within a given group. Smarter people are on the average having fewer kids. And that we have some reasonable estimates on, or genetic estimates. Recently, one in Iceland, one in the United States. And those agree with what you'd look at just from looking at the demographics and putting in heritability. So they're 1 point a generation within a given group. Movements of other groups could be bigger. Like I would talk to people who would be marveling about how the schools had gone to hell in the Bronx because you used to have kids who did really well and now they don't. And I said, they used to be Jewish and now they're Puerto Rican. There is no mystery. The teachers may not have gotten any worse at all. And then they just say, well, why do you think that? I said, because that's how everything in the world works all the time with no exceptions. So, yeah, that's why you should think. I mean, shit, you grew up in this place. How could you not see it? I grew up in a little white bread town in the middle of nowhere. Why is it I know more about what's going on in New York than you do who've lived there your whole life? I think it's strange. But again, they probably worked hard at not knowing. That was never something that appealed to me.
Have you noticed that the Overton window has perhaps even tightened since Trump became president?
Some ways yes, some ways no. But I don't care anyhow, so it doesn't matter to me. Not too much.
Do you think it's a good idea that an ethnic lobby such as the Anti-Defamation League essentially decides what can be said on social media?
They haven't stopped me from saying anything yet.
And so if it doesn't affect you, you don't really care?
I think it doesn't affect anybody who has much guts. The answer is, of course, most people don't. So I guess it does affect a lot of people. Like I know people, I know examples. For example, a few years ago, Nicholas Wade had a book out on talking about his more like psychological differences between races, and which probably exist. But it wasn't a terribly good book, by the way. Part of the problem is you start talking genetics, there's no real substitute for knowing genetics, and he didn't know very much. But people denounced the book, and they got a bunch of geneticists to sign, one of these. I think ideally you put these letters are announced in Pravda, and then you get everybody to sign how they're opposed this enemy of the people. If you want to do the tradition right. But I know that some of the people who signed it don't believe a word of it. Now, I don't know about all of them, but I have connections with some. And I know some of them said, well, I felt like I had to because, I'm coming up to get tenure and I could get blah, 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 blah. I also know a few people who said, fuck it, I'm not signing this, not if I don't think it's true. But there's a shortage in academia compared to many other places of courage. Courage is sometimes called the first of the virtues because it let everything else actually play out. But we don't seem to see a lot of it in a lot of circles in the U.S. Like Stalin thought you had to kill people to get people to babble nonsense. And evidently, merely threatening to not give them tenure or not invite them to parties was easily enough. He may have killed millions of people more than he needed to. Of course, I actually think he liked killing people. So, it's possible that the dictating society was only a secondary purpose for him. He probably the real advantage was he just got to shoot somebody, which I think he liked. But it's interesting. Every now and then I like to say, well, it's a free country, mainly because as a sort of a punchline.
What do you think of the alt-right?
I probably don't think about them a whole lot. In the areas I'm interested, I haven't seen them come up with, creative answers to, again, a lot of that's some technical areas. Some of it is trying to figure out certain questions about genetics or historical things or anything. It might be that if I'm talking about a new way to do a calculation, somehow none of them have ever helped me or said anything useful. Or if they say, if you have a theory of how things work, how are its predictions doing? I haven't seen them be spectacularly successful at any of that. So anyhow, some of them pay attention to me. I don't pay much attention to them, basically.
What do you think of the work of Steve Saylor?
Oh, Steve's okay. I like Steve. I know him.
Why do you think Europeans have dominated the world and invented most everything important over the past 500 years?
It's a fair question. I can answer part of it, but I can't give a complete answer. I said, well, compared to a lot of places, they're smarter. Most of the world isn't smart enough that you'd expect to see a lot of people born with the abilities to solve really difficult puzzles. Okay. The fraction is not super high anywhere, but it could be to the point where it's very low enough that not much happens. And that's true of most of the world. The interesting exception to this is you see, if anything, somewhat higher scores in places like China, but in the past 500 years, there hasn't been much innovation out of China. And if you stretch it further, it goes further than that. One thing economists talk about is, why did Europe become more advanced than China after 1800? I said, well, one reason is they were more advanced than China before 1800. So, for example, actual real mathematics was originally developed by the Greeks. And although it went through ups and downs, it was not entirely lost. Axiomatic, starting out with basic assumptions and logically building up things. That is a Greek and event later, a Western civilization thing. And the Chinese, for most of their history until very recently, just didn't do that. They did some math, but they never had they never had formal math. They never did proofs. Not in the way that people did in the Western tradition. And there were all sorts of things that Archimedes knew that nobody in China knew in 1800. If you go back to 1700, before they started having Jesuits visit China, the Chinese didn't know the world was round. They had a very effective agriculture. They were skilled in some things like metallurgy, but in anything that's very abstract, something that's more like a science, they just didn't do it. They hadn't done it. They do it now. with some success. But for most of history, they just didn't. At the very most advanced end, Europe was just enormously more sophisticated than China in, say, 1800. Like in 1798, there was a British physicist who built an experiment with two heavy lead balls, like 60 pounds each, so he could directly measure the gravitational force between them. That is such a sensitive and fantastic experiment. And people did this before 1800. Or there were people who were trying to figure out the exact time, because you could use that in navigation. That could tell you exactly how far east or west you were. So there were people saying, well, just watch the moons of Jupiter and use them as a natural clock in the sky. Which works, but it doesn't work on a cloudy day, and it doesn't work in the daytime. But the point is, Europeans at the top level were doing enormously sophisticated things by this period. And it goes back a long time. There were ups and downs. I mean, the Dark Ages, there's a real slowdown in this, but it came back. You got to the point where there were individual Europeans, say Newton, who accomplished more in science than other whole civilizations in 1,000 years. Why? There's mysteries about it. I mean, one is the Chinese today are not doing a whole lot of innovation, at least as far as I've been able to tell. And I ask probably every year people who know what's going, what really fascinating idea that you would never have thought of that knocks your socks off has come out of Korea or China or Japan. And the answer is not much yet. Why did it ever? I mean, Europe and their descendants are still capable of it, and that includes the Ashkenazi Jews. But then they're mostly European, right? But there's other people where that just never happens. China may happen; they've at least got the smarts, but they don't. There must be other qualities involved, and I don't pretend to understand them perfectly. For all I know, it's being a nut. There are thoughts that only a nut would have.
Well, there are thoughts that pretty much only Northern European peoples have, and that is universal morality. Basically, nobody else looks at the world in terms of one universal morality. Pretty much every other people in the world practice tribal morality. Would you say that's an accurate assessment?
Probably. No, probably not. I mean, certainly, look, there's been other areas that were Christian in the past that aren't now, and they certainly seem to believe in the same general ideas when North Africa wasn't Christian, when Syria was mostly Christian, when Palestine was mostly Christian. And I don't see it dramatically different in Southern Europe either. And I also remember lots of recent history with people like slave traders or Blackbeard who are Northern European as anybody. And, when the milk of human kindness was ladled out, they were not in the line. Easy to find people like that. I think something else is going on. I wouldn't call it the only people with universal morality. Although, I mean, certainly not everybody has that, but there have been other groups that did in various times in history. The Romans had sort of an idea of universal morality. And after a while, half the time, they even feebly tried to execute it when they were no longer enslaving everybody in sight. But Northern Europeans are certainly acting screwy right now. But I think that might be the most accurate way of describing it, as opposed to a universal long-term trend. I said, what did Liverpool grow on? I said, the slave trade. That wasn't a perfect example of universal morality.
Yeah, of course there are exceptions, but all the countries with the most high trust and low corruption are countries created by Northern Europeans, such as England, the United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand.
There are some screwy ideas that are currently popular in some of those areas, and some of them seem kind of screwy in the direction you're saying. But I would claim that, so how strong were those ideas in 1900? The answer is not very.
Well, in the world I see around me right now, Northern European peoples are the most likely to be honest in business. So there's just no comparison.
Well, but the point is, honesty is not the same as bending over backwards for every asshole that wants to, for example, move to your country and live off your welfare system. It was certainly not something that people did in 1940. I can't project backward if it wasn't there in previous times. I think people want to make a picture That's what the phrase they use in intelligence. I want to make all this be a coherent story. I said, but what if it isn't? I said, does the United States look like that in 1800? No. Does it look like that in 1900? I said, not really. I mean, there are some things that you could say, like, do people in principle think there should be sort of a common set of rules for everybody? The answer is, yeah, kind of, sort of, with a lot of exceptions. But for example, what if you had a group of people that hated your guts and were on the whole not very useful when they came in? What would people have said in 1900? I said, well, you're out of here. Just like that. Would they say, well, we have to be consistent on principles? They'd say, no, we don't. We have to do something sensible. Like, let's suppose that the religion of the Aztecs was still alive in Mexico. And worshippers of Huitzilopochtli made up a big part of Mexicans coming into the country. And whenever they got a chance, they'd catch somebody and cut their heart out. Well, many people today, like whoever's running the New York Times, would say, well, you know, everybody's got a real right to their own customs, especially if they're hostile ones. But I can tell you that there were times in the past, most of the history of the United States, most of the history of England, people said, they're out of here. The minute that they started to cause serious trouble.
Right. I mean, Northern Europeans used to have a sense of themselves and a will to rule, but they've lost that in the last 100 years. They've chosen to commit suicide, and I don't understand why.
Well, they haven't committed suicide as much as the Census Bureau would make you think. For example, one question they have is what percentage of people have English ancestry? And for most people, English ancestry is like such a common thing. It's like, you know, it's like saying I had food for supper. So, like if somebody, and lots of people have English ancestry in the country, often dominant. I checked this out in my hometown against the census things. People said, well, only 20% of the people in my hometown, which is a little rural town in Illinois, say they have English ancestry. I said, I looked at the actual names. I said, it's 80%. But if somebody is 1/16 Irish, they say they're Irish. If they're 1/8 Italian, they say you're Italian. You know, it's like being English is like, it's like what odor does air have?
Yeah, so the war against Anglo identity is massively incentivized.
But it doesn't mean that I know people who think these people have actually decreased greatly in numbers, and they haven't. They're still there, but different labels are being applied. It's not the same as actually vanishing. I mean, like Henry Harpending. Henry Harpending was like a full 1/64th Dutch. That's where his last name came from. But the rest was mainly, you know, mostly general, mostly British ancestry from places in upper New York State. He said, but it's more fun to be Dutch. The other thing is that particular line of the family used to own a farm, which they later gave to a church with the condition that they would get it back if they ever stopped using it for a particular purpose. That farm was on Manhattan Island. And they tried to get it back because the church stopped doing the thing. And like, let me tell you the names of some of the streets on either on the edge of that farm. Wall Street. and as Henry said, and if we had just won that suit, I would not be a professor of anthropology today. Of course, if I had won a suit like that, I'd probably try to farm the place just to freak out all the New Yorkers. You know, I'd raise pigs. But anyhow, a lot of this is a state of mind. Like, for example, if there's certain people said, well, you know, the future is inevitably going on our side. I said, but you just lost the election. Well, we didn't really lose it. I said, yes, you did. You actually lost it. And if you keep going crazier and crazier, you'll lose the next 3. I mean, the Democratic Party's response to losing the election is strange this time, really strange. And it's not helpful to them. But that's my prediction, but we'll see. You know, making up elaborate fantasies as to why you lost is not the way to win in the future.
I remember when there were white shoe firms on Wall Street, meaning no Jews allowed, because they wanted to maintain an Anglo morality in their firm. But
there might have been other reasons as well.
Such as?
Maybe they didn't like them. It doesn't necessarily boil down to, it could be partly what you said. It could be other things as well, is all I'm saying. But go ahead.
Well, whatever happened to freedom of assembly? Now that's illegal. That's been illegal for 40 years. And so, yeah, as an Orthodox Jew, I can go to an Orthodox synagogue or I can go to a Jewish community center, but where are the white community centers? Where are the white shoe firms today? Like how are Anglos going to be able to maintain any kind of strength and pride and cohesion in the face of this multicultural onslaught?
Well, I think they should never lack for laughs.
How long do you anticipate the United States will dominate the world, and do you expect China will eventually supplant America?
Well, the strategic, being able to think even like as complicated as a risk game, China is the coming rival. Now, what will happen? I said, well, I wrote a long essay about this in 1999, which is apparently ahead of the time because I got nobody interested in it at all. But it was called China as Rival. And I said, it's different from the Soviet Union. I said, why? They're bigger. They're less economically stupid. Now, one thing is they probably won't be able to get a lot of ideological followers in the United States because they aren't really very ideological anymore. They'll get Chinese American followers, but they won't get people like the Rosenbergs, I think. They won't get ideological. I just believe in China ruling. They're probably brighter than the Russians, although not overwhelmingly so. I'd say it looks difficult. Like one of the things that logically happens in things like this is whenever somebody looks like they're starting to gather all the marbles, other people start to gather together to oppose them. The old pattern of history in Europe. Spain is the most powerful. Various coalitions form against it. France is the most powerful. Various coalitions form against it. Again, England is often a key player of these coalitions. Germany is the most powerful. Various coalitions oppose it. Russia is, at least in Europe, the most powerful. Various coalitions oppose it. So you would predict that one of our allies in any struggle with China, which is likely, considering the way humans act, would be Russia. And all the bit about, Russia is our great foe. I said, no, they're not. I know what they did in the Cold War. Every Russian KGB agent everywhere on earth was trying to stir up trouble against the United States in fucking Peru or Trinidad or every place that had a name. Not always terribly successfully. Half the time the locals would say, you gave us money. Thank you very much. Now we got our own fish to fry. But they were always doing it. Now the Russians trying to weaken U.S. influence in Brazil, they don't give a crap. The only place they're interested in is probably the Ukraine and maybe Syria. They're not on a worldwide crusade to fuck us in every possible orifice. They're not, and it's no point pretending that they are. Nor are they, fantastic imperialists because they've seized the Crimea. It was full of Russians, and they wanted to be in it. And that's all they've done, pretty much. So, but yeah, will we have trouble with China? I said, yeah, for all I know, it's impossible to resist them, and for all I know, it'll turn out to be trivial. It's hard to predict. Like the Chinese just made one major mistake, which they didn't have to make. They're going for one-man rule. Lifetime, one-man rule. Now, that lifetime doesn't really mean lifetime. You get old and feeble enough, they'll kick him out. But, this previous system, it wasn't very well organized, but it was sort of, people are waiting for their turn at the trough. But, one-man rule, China's had that before. It's not a great idea. It's not often a good idea for anyone. But the typical pundit, if they explained that he was going to become God King, they'd say, well, yeah, that's really a way in which they're going to become more progressive. They suck up to whoever has the power in a way that's kind of silly. Or, like the guy's effectively running Saudi Arabia. We have heard lots of talk, well, he's going to do all sorts of reforms and things. I said, well, what he's actually done was managed to get involved in Syria, fund guys who are completely psychotic and lose. Managed to get involved in Yemen when there was no advantage to it and then not win. Managed to kidnap the prime minister of Lebanon for not being pro-Saudi enough. Managed to torture half the businessmen in his country. Like, I have this theory that if you torture a bunch of billionaires and then let them go, you might wake up with a new mouth. Or with somebody blows your head off. He's a strange guy, and yet our establishment loves him.
Well, John Mearsheimer says that if he was president of the United States, he'd kick out every Chinese student because China's our obvious most immediate peer competitor. So why are we educating the people who are heading towards supplanting us? What do you think of that analysis?
I should read that. I've read some things by Mearsheimer, and he's not usually an idiot. I would say you could say something for that, but we should certainly keep all the liberal arts students. I mean, what if we can teach them all the stupid things we've learned? To the point where they can no longer bend over and pick up a $100 bill off the sidewalk, which is currently the general state of our ruling classes, or take a crap without, detailed manual. What if we could make them as screwy as us?
But they think differently. The viruses that affect the white man are not going to affect the yellow man in the same way.
Well, I mean, communism had its day with them, and for all you know, they're ready to try it again. I mean, also I cheat. I read. I remember things way before I was born. But China had a tremendous appetite for goofiness too. They're not going to be forever. Look, the mere fact that we have a guy who's decided he's going to be president for life is a sign that they aren't on the straight and narrow when it comes to being practical. No,
but they're never going to go in for Freudian analysis.
Well, read about the Cultural Revolution. If we're going to have one of those things, this is like, who is the stupidest team in baseball? And in any given year, different people would appear to be the stupidest team in baseball. Certainly right now, we're threatening to set a record. But times change. They've changed before, and they'll change again. That's probably my favorite line in the Bible. And it came to pass. It never says it came to stay.
But if we get to the point where we can select embryos so that we can select the smartest one, don't you think China's obviously going to do that many, many years before us because they have fewer moral qualms?
I don't know. I can tell you that I've heard a lot about all the really advanced things China must, either in terms of research or in terms of application, and none of them were true yet. There's people say, well, Beijing Genetics Corporation is doing X. Then I talked to people who were actually interacting with them, and they said they never got around to doing anything. They're run by short-sighted businessmen who don't understand the science. Not much is happening. They've hired people who didn't know anything about it, and unfortunately, that stayed true. Now, that doesn't mean it's always going to be true, but so far, since I actually have talked to people who have communicated with what's going on inside Chinese human genetics, nothing very interesting has come out of there, nor are there any credible reports that they've, as yet, done anything that would be very interesting. Now, that could change, and you might be right. I can certainly imagine scenarios in which victory goes to the most ruthless. But I can imagine a million things. Not all of my imaginations are right. But they might do that. But remember, there's a thing even people at the top think of, which is, like, I want to create a bunch of people who are a lot better at this than I am or my kids. You see the problem. Yeah. If you want to make super able people, what makes you think that they aren't a threat as well as a resource? I mean, if you were the hereditary dictatorship, would you want a bunch of guys who have a lot, given any chance at all, they're going to kick you out because they're just better? Yeah. There's upsides and there's downsides. Even a ruthless group might say, that's what we want. Here was an example. Saddam Hussein, he needed a general that could beat Iran in that long war, but he also wanted a general who would in no way become well thought of and famous, because any such general would immediately overthrow him. So he couldn't even let generals try to win in a decisive way, because he was so afraid of what would happen to him if he had his own successful little patent or something. So it meant that what he told them to do with their tanks was dig holes in the ground and use them as pillboxes, even when he had all the tanks and the Iranians had none, because he was afraid of his own forces, and with reason. Okay, now would that be true in China if we had a bunch of new coming guys? Because, it isn't just the dictator himself. He expects that his children and the children of other people at these high levels, they expect to have cushy jobs, to be near the top of the system. Will that stay true if you produce a bunch of people that are just fucking sharper on average than any human group? Do
you think that Lee Harvey Oswald was solely responsible for the death of JFK?
It's not something I know enormous amounts about, but there's certainly no reason why it takes more than one guy to shoot somebody. All it takes, there's this common feeling like, well, he's famous, so you need famous people can't be killed by an ordinary guy with a pistol. There has to be a special reason. I don't believe that's true, but I will give you my alternate theory that I constructed one day in which I was trying to see how many different alternate Kennedy assassination theories I could construct in a single day. This is my favorite one. We have this guy who is a West Texas rancher, older than Kennedy a little bit, World War II veteran, tough. And he has a young, very pretty, and very wayward wife. And she starts having an affair with JFK. And he talks, he sends a message, he says, look, she's married, this can't continue, I will not put up with it. And Kennedy blows him off. So when Kennedy comes to Texas, our hero shoots him in the head because he's fucking his wife. And then, let me continue. Then the she calms down for a while, but she's still young and she's really wild. And she gets involved first with JFK, with RFK, and then with Martin Luther King. And he has to shoot all three of them for his personal honor. And then, so this is all told by a new Franz Tiersman who spent his entire life looking for the real killer. He's been, digging through documents and so forth. He finally finds it is no ideology at all, just one pissed off ex-Marine rancher. And then finally he's totally flustered. He said, and what happened after that? He said, well, she settled down. She's been a good help on the ranch. We've raised kids. It's all gone pretty well. And then she offers, after he killed Martin, I knew he really loved me. That's my theory.
But what about Lee Harvey visiting the Cuban embassy in Mexico City just a few weeks before the assassination? Do you give any significance to that?
Look, why about him spending 2 years defecting to the Soviet Union? I know a lot about Lee Harvey Oswald. He was a communist. He tried to shoot somebody else, but he missed. Walker, this right-wing general of the time, the bullet went through the window and missed him. As far as I know, he was a left-winger who just felt like shooting somebody important. That was not a real left-winger, and Kennedy wasn't, although, some of the people around him were kind of sappy. But there doesn't have to be a more complicated reason. There could be. I don't know. But I don't really know any evidence for it. Again, it's not something I've spent most of my life looking at other than to come up with jokes about it. I do remember that, all the evidence, I do know, for example, the Warren Commission was afraid of finding that the Cubans, or worse yet, the Russians were behind it, because they said, what, so we're going to have a war? They said, we don't want a war with Russia. It's not worth it. And they're right. Atomic weapons are powerful, and there's no real defense against if the other guy has more than a few, and ICBMs to carry them. I know they were worried about that. I don't know they ever found anything interesting. Is this typical of something the Russians would do? No, they weren't that stupid. There were a lot of informal rules, which actually grew with time. More and more things that neither side did. For example, in the 50s, the Russians pulled a few assassinations in Germany. They used this little cyanide gun, and they just, pop it in your face, and when you were asleep, you'd wake up and inhale it, be instantly dead. Those were Ukrainians that they were getting who had been involved in anti-Soviet partisan warfare in World War II. But they stopped. More and more, they kept saying, well, it's like there's unwritten rules. Very seldom did either side kill an agent, at least in any directly. Maybe you'd have somebody else do it, but usually they just didn't. It would be unlikely the Russians would have done it. Now, the Cubans, Castro could be a complete fool. Like during the missile crisis, he was saying, well, let's drop it. Let's fire these missiles. And Khrushchev was telling him, you're insane. He said, you're running a country. You know what'll happen? He said, America will be ruined, Russia will be ruined, and Cuba won't exist at all. He said, Khrushchev thought Castro was a complete fool. Now, maybe he changed, but maybe he hadn't. So, would this be the sort of risk? You could say, what? But there have been attempts to assassinate Castro. Fair is fair. I said, well, fair is not fair when the other country's 1,000 times stronger than you. You don't want to step on Superman's cape. Now, that doesn't prove they didn't do it, because Castro did stupid things. Is it possible? Sure. But is it necessary? All it takes is one guy with a rifle or a pistol. It's not. You don't need a conspiracy. You just need one guy. But there can be conspiracies, but they're not necessary. One bullet will kill anybody.
What about the 9/11 attack? Are you satisfied that we citizens of the United States have been told everything that's important to know?
Most, not all. I mean, if we knew more about, look, we know where most of the guys came from, which is the Saudis and the Trucial sheikdoms and one Egyptian. And I think that's about it. I think maybe one guy from Lebanon. At any rate, and we know that, in terms of who's interested in that kind of politics, that kind of Salafism, it's funded by Saudis. Sometimes at an official level in terms of madrasas, sometimes by individual nutty billionaires who are, funding this or the other guerrilla group. I said, so if there's anybody else who's heavily involved besides the people who actually did it, it's the Saudis, with possible later involvement by the Pakistanis. But they're our friends. But they're special friends. The sort of friends we'd all be better off if every one of them were dead.
Osama bin Laden listed 3 reasons for why he attacked the United States on 9/11, one of them being America's close relationship with the Jewish state of Israel. How seriously should we take Osama bin Laden's reasons? And do you think the United States would have been hit on 9/11 except for its strong relationship with Israel?
He's probably telling the truth. Though there were other things that seem odder to us. In the fact that we had troops in Saudi Arabia some of the time, particularly in the Gulf War, it was like particularly sensitive to him and some Saudis. There should never be foreigners, non-Islamic foreigners, on the sacred soil of the sacred sand of Saudi Arabia. That was probably also important to him. Was that other thing important? Sure. Lots of Arabs don't like it. Why would they? There's no reason to like it.
Do you think it's I'm sorry, go ahead.
Would it have happened without our involvement with Israel? Hard to know. It probably increased the chance, sure.
Is America's close relationship with Israel in America's interest?
Not yet. No, once in a while. Usually not. I can remember a time that it was. But most of the time, no. And certainly professional diplomats have generally always thought that. People like on the issue of recognizing Israel, people like George Marshall said it's a bad idea. People like, trying to remember who was the then head of the Defense Department. He thought it was a bad idea. Dean Acheson thought it was a bad idea. They threatened to resign over it. They thought it was such a bad idea. Now, there were people who thought it was a good idea. Stalin thought it was a good idea, but he changed his mind. Stalin supported the founding of the State of Israel because he said it will radicalize the Arabs against the Western powers, which primarily in that year meant England. But he thought that would be true. But he changed his mind probably within the year. And that's because he found out that Jews in the Soviet Union were all enthusiastic about the founding of the State of Israel. Golda Meir came on a visit, and she got a tremendous crowd reaction. And Stalin said, okay, so you Jews are emotionally connected to Israel. I said, well, that means I can't trust you anymore. And he started pulling, there was a particular moment in which, like with Stalin, everybody is always in danger of being on his shit list. I mean, it's hard not to be on the shit list. But in general, Jews had not been particularly. They were some in the past because there was more of them than average in the Communist Party. But, there were ones that he didn't try to kill, too. I mean, like Kanovich, like Beria, who's actually a mountain Jew, talking about obscure groups coming out of the Caucasus. But he decided that Jews, many of them, had emotional connection to Israel, and that meant he couldn't trust them anymore. And so he stopped accepting Jews at the Frunze Academy, their equivalent of West Point. They had a diplomatic academy. Again, it was 48 or 49. They stopped accepting them. In general, and a lot of people think he was building up to something close to a purge that might have been pretty huge, but we're not sure. This is towards the very end of his life, the doctor's plot period, where the people were talking about, there was a little area on the Chinese border where they were talking about moving all the Jews to, which probably would have killed a lot of people somehow just because of the transition and ending up in the middle of nowhere. But at any rate, it didn't happen. But he disliked and distrusted them because he thought that they had dual loyalties. He had not thought that in 1947. But it's a problem. In a sense, he significantly contributed to himself because they, under his permission, Czechoslovakia sent 100,000 rifles, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but, the 48 war is a small, low-tech war. They sent a bunch of good German machine guns that have been captured. That's about the size of it. It's small compared to later aid by other players, but it was important at the time. Another thing that happened around the same time is in some parts of Eastern Europe, the guys that he had stuck in running the country were Jewish. Around the same time, he got rid of them. I don't know if it was entirely because he didn't feel he could trust them anymore. Part of it was probably because everybody hated them, like Clement Gottwald in Czechoslovakia. They put in some other one of the reasons they picked them is some of these countries had barely even had a communist party. It was hard to find a local guy who you could use in places like, it was hard to find people who had been in the Communist Party in Poland. It was hard in Hungary. There just weren't very many. So they sort of picked, utility communist players. The very first layer they picked was Jewish because they figured, well, you'll work with us. Because, you certainly won't work with the Germans or anything. But later they, look, Stalin, Stalin was like George Steinbrenner with a machine gun. He didn't just fire the manager every couple of years. He'd kill him. So, I'm sure he would have replaced anybody. But this is what happened. Anyhow, but that the Jews had been sort of full players. They weren't running the Soviet Union, but they were full players. Some of the important people were Jewish. That rapidly decreased being true after 1948. And a lot of it boils down to Stalin's reaction to the formation to other people's reaction to the formation of the State of Israel. He thought, I can't trust you.
Isn't it crazy that all these various people like Stalin had this crazy idea that Jewish citizens had dual loyalty?
Well, he was probably acting a little prematurely because all he'd really seen for the most part, was people cheering Golda Meir. But it's not. Well, remember, Stalin's ability to trust may not have been real high on the human scale. I'm trying to be fair here. The fact that he distrusts you is not the same as an honest evaluation that you are perfectly untrustworthy. But were there guys who had a lot of emotional loyalty to Israel? Sure. I don't know how many in Russia. There certainly have been in the United States.
And does that disturb you as a patriotic American citizen?
It causes trouble sometimes, but I can tell you a couple of times it actually worked in a positive way, just to be fair. There was times after Vietnam in which Americans as a whole didn't want to fight for anybody, anywhere, for any reason. I saw polls that showed less than half the country would be willing to fight if Canada was invaded, although a full 46% were willing to send arms to the poor Canucks. People's reaction to Vietnam was irrational and maximum at that time. So there was a particular stupid senator from California, different from today's stupid senators from California, named Alan Cranston, which may ring a bell. And he didn't want to even vote for the military authorization bill. Because, we don't need an army, etc. Okay, well, Simcha Dinitz, who was the Israeli ambassador to the United States, came over and talked to him. He said a couple of things. He said, you can't protect Israel if you can't protect yourself. And the other thing he said, where do you think most of your contributions come from? Okay, I have spoken. Now, I claim Simcha Dinitz was doing something that was positive for the United States. Because even if the only reason that sold was we have to be strong so we can protect Israel, so strong we could even protect ourselves, I'd say Simcha Dinitz was on the side of the angels that day. But is this true most of the time? No.
So
on the whole, we've got in trouble.
Oh, sorry.
What?
Just to change the subject real quick, because I don't want to miss the question.
Go ahead.
Drive. I don't know what this is, but I'm being asked to ask you if it's going to work.
Say again. What?
The EM drive?
No, sorry. Wish it would. No. I don't expect there's any special exemptions in the laws of conservation of momentum. Sorry, I do still wear a physics hat now and then. I wish there are a lot of things I wish would work, but this one's not even plausible. There are things that almost work. This isn't one of them. I don't believe it. And by the way, if I were wrong, I'd get down on my knees and thank God to see the world was more interesting. But I would also be very surprised. I'm willing. Yes.
I apologize. Finish your point. Oh, okay. Then I apologize for interrupting a second time. I apologize. But who do you think was the most important personality of the 20th century?
Did we lose him?
I hate to say it, but it's probably Hitler, unfortunately. You didn't say good personnel. You said
no. Just the man. Who was the man of the 20th? Most influential, most important.
I won't call him most representative. There are lots of things. Like there are things that could have happened with some other German popping up on top. I could imagine people trying to, deal Germany in a better situation than they had under the Versailles Treaty. In the long run, that was likely. But, there are a lot of people out of sense that, let's just fucking attack everybody in sight. You don't have to be a mutant to, there actually are human beings who wake up in the morning and says, well, what if we lost? There are people who have small c conservatism and don't look for every possible kind of trouble. They're not even incredibly rare. So if you'd had somebody like that, you wouldn't have gone very far. And by the way, there are people who talk about how hard Germany had it in the Versailles Treaty. We also know the kind of thing that Germany was going to do if they won, because they did some of them when they occupied Belgium, when they carved Russia to pieces, when Russia lost in 1917. And we also know they had plans to do things like annex Belgium, to annex northern France, and even if they had lots of Russian territory, they didn't have a whole. No, in World War I, they weren't talking about killing all the Russians, but they certainly weren't talking about letting them vote either. Anyhow, the proposed actions of Germany, if they won World War I, were about 6 times worse than what happened to them when they lost. In fact, some people say you should have been harsher on them, make it so they couldn't start a second war, which, of course, is what we did afterwards by dividing Germany and occupying it and so forth. But, there are people talking about poor, pitiful Germany. I said most of them aren't Belgians.
Right, but Germany has no natural defensible borders, so it is surrounded by enemies. So in both wars, it was logical and rational for it to launch the wars. It only could win fast wars, and it almost...
They didn't have to, World War II, they didn't have to fight at all.
Of course they did. They were surrounded by enemies. Stalin was going to invade them and go west.
France was not interested in a fight if they could possibly avoid it.
Stalin was ready to wipe them out.
No. Now, Stalin, that's a complicated subject, but, for example, there is a book, a false book, talking about how, Hitler, Stalin was within a week or two of starting a war with Germany in the summer of 1941. That's not true. There's no truth to it. And the reason you can tell is something as simple as simply making sure all your tanks are running and you fixed all of them, which is one of the things you do the week before. None of that had happened. I mean, there's a million things the Germans were doing. The Germans were sneaking sappers in to tap the phones and cut the phone lines. They were flying overflights every day. The Russians weren't doing any of those things. The Germans were getting ready to invade. The Russians were not. But in the long run, the Russians were getting stronger. And it says, is there any ideological reason Stalin wouldn't have started a war if he was sure he could win, say in 42 or 3? It's perfectly possible. He wasn't a man of peace. But I'll tell you one thing he wasn't. He wasn't cocky. And Hitler was. I mean, for example, what's the most recent military experience the Russians had before that? They'd attacked Finland, and they had a whole lot of trouble with it. Finland's a dinky country, and the Finns killed 5 times their number of attacking Russians. The Russians lost like 250,000. Of course, they were Finns. Let's be fair. But, the Russian army didn't look very good. It didn't help that Stalin had executed most of the top generals within the last 2 years. Stalin was strategically cautious, usually. Probably the least strategically cautious thing he ever did was authorize the Korean War. And there he was just foolishly listening to Dean Acheson when he talked about, here's the countries we're going to defend, here's the countries we're not, which little drawing did not contain South Korea. But Stalin was not a gambler, and Hitler was a gambler. And by the way, you know what happens if you keep gambling? You lose. But enemies. I said, look, France didn't want to fight anybody. They'd had all the fighting they wanted and more in World War I. They weren't even terribly willing to fight to defend France. They didn't want to do it. And as for natural boundaries, well, I said, if the French built the Maginot Line along the eastern border with Germany, and by the way, you couldn't have cracked it. They had to go around. What's the are Germans incapable of building things? What if they build a Maginot Line? They talk about the West Wall. It wasn't that fancy, but it could have been. What if they'd build a Maginot Line? Nobody in the West could have cracked it. Now, the Russians are another problem, but, it wasn't overwhelming. And it's certainly true that in the near future, the Russians weren't actually looking to fight Germany because they had no confidence in their army. And you might say Stalin had no confidence in his fate. Hitler knew whatever he did, it would work because he was him. He was mistaken, but it worked for a while.
Did you ever read Mein Kampf?
Nah. I've read things about it. I've never read it.
For Carl Schmitt, in his book, The Concept of Political, the basis of politics is the us versus them distinction. Does that make sense to you?
There's a lot of times in which people are perfectly happy to get through the day and get, make a living. There's whole countries that can spend extended periods and they're not feeling. There's other countries which they can't not think about attacking their neighbors. But there's plenty. Like, when's the last time Spain was really acting like they're in the mood to take on the rest of Europe?
16th century.
It's been a while, hasn't it? I said, there are long-term tides in these things. It isn't just national strength, although that's part of it. It's also, the idea, like at one point people are writing books talking about, Ernst Junger is writing Storm of Steel, which is, what does not kill me makes me terribly strong. And other people, Germany, are saying, I don't think we could get out of bed to resist it if anybody invaded today. There's different tides in the thoughts of men. And I can tell you, in France in 1940, they weren't interested in attacking anybody. And it wasn't easy to see when that was going to change. England was not interested in attacking anybody. They weren't as totally had the spirit beat out of them as France, but they weren't looking for a war, not even slightly. And I don't even think the Soviet Union was looking for a war. And by the way, they're even less looking for it after World War II. World War II was hard for the Russians. I think people underestimate how hard. I think Americans don't realize what it's like. If you look at the year classes, like the guys who were 18 in 1941, that class was there through the whole war. And by the way, some of them had been killed before the war because of things like purges and various death camps and the Civil War and typhus and anyhow. But the fraction of them that were alive altogether in 1945 was 18%. There were whole generations in which most of the men who were good enough to fight were dead. Russia was hurt worse than they wanted to admit and worse than I think we realized. The Russians, they were trouble, but they were cautious trouble. By the way, I would bet that if the Chinese decide to be trouble, they'll probably be cautious trouble too. They've been pretty cautious. They're saying, we want to grow. We want to develop our strength. We're not looking to look for trouble until we've already won, really.
What role does morality play in power politics?
I think it's more important than people think. Like Mearsheimer and company, the so-called realists, they say, well, people really do things for rational state reasons. And I said, do tell. I said, well, certainly that explains our support of Israel, which puts us in the hole. He said, well, that's an exception. I said, would you like me to start listing the other exceptions? There were plenty of times in dynastic politics in Europe where the reason country X was with country Y was literally because your sister lives there. Now, is that a rational power politics reason? Or here's another one. There was a Venetian noblewoman who was kidnapped by corsairs and taken to the harem of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and evidently she had something going on because he was completely whipped for the entire rest of his life, and he could do a lot of things, but he never did anything to really hurt Venice, even though they're a competitor, because she would say, don't do that, or I'm going to have a headache for the next week. And it worked even better than that because she finagled to have her son be the next sultan, and she was running his life for the next 20 years. Now, what is the strategic reason that this chick could half run the Ottoman Empire. I said, it's not what we call a national strategic reason. Things like that happen. I mean, by the way, the other reasons happen too, but even then, half the time, they're not rational strategic reasons. Like everybody in Europe wanted a chunk of Africa. There's a great rush for Africa in the 1890s. All right, how many made any money out of it? How many were better off for controlling part of Africa?
Nobody.
Maybe King Leopold as an individual. Even then, everybody remembers him as a.
But in the competition between China and the United States, does which country is more moral have anything to do with who will win that competition?
It can in some cases. I mean, I know plenty of, I can think of a couple of countries that tried to be just as obnoxious as they possibly could, and it didn't in World War II, and it didn't do them a bit of good. There were all sorts of people who said, the Germans are just dreadful. Even people who are not directly connected with the story would say, look, there were Japanese who were disgusted with the Germans. Sometimes this mattered. Well, here's a little example from the South Pacific. We're in Guadalcanal. You have local Melanesians living off in the forest. You have an American base. You have Japanese on the north end of the island. They're trying to attack. Okay, what happens if an American plane is shot down? Well, the locals try to help him. They try to get him back. They usually do. What happens if a Japanese is shot down? They said, well, they used to not know what the Japanese were like, but then they got to meet them because the Japanese would go to an island and just bayonet people because they were bored. So what happens when those Japanese pilots land in one of these islands in the Solomons full of local natives? They kill them. They said, why? Because you're sons of bitches. That's why. I mean, compared to you, the British and Australians, are saints. I mean, they send doctors and missionaries. You go and steal what little food we have and then bayonet somebody. You're just assholes. Now, what was the strategic payoff of being an asshole? There wasn't any. Now, by the way, this is why we won in Guadalcanal, because they lost all those pilots. Or we had what they call the coast watchers, guys with a radio who'd be watching the Japanese planes come in. Generally, the locals helped them. They needed to because the radio was as heavy as a refrigerator. You needed 6 guys to move it. The locals said, these Americans, these Brits, they're not that bad. You don't try to kill us. They don't just, kick us in the crotch because they're bored. Similarly, what if the Germans, when they invaded Russia, they had said, you might have something to gain. We might be better than Stalin. That's not an impossible goal. But they didn't try.
Who's the most important person in the United States today?
Hopefully someone I've never heard of yet, who's growing and learning, is going to do something that we'll all say, this kid really knew his shit.
Who's the most powerful person in the United States today?
Trump, probably. Though he's kind of limited. He has a lot of opposition, but he is president.
Who would you say the top 5 most powerful people in the United States today?
I don't know if I can make that estimate. This is not a list I keep in my head. I don't think I know.
What is the deep state? Is it significant?
I think we had a lot of guys who are used to people. They're used to being in Washington, and having any outsider seems threatening in ways that are hard for me to understand emotionally. They said, you just can't have somebody from outside our system get in there. I said, so much so that says, well, somebody must have thrown the election. I said, now how the hell would you do that? No votes have been stolen. Well, but we think somebody spent $40,000 on pro-Trump ads who were actually just clickbaiters. I said, give me a fucking break. I said, I saw those ads, the one in which Jesus Christ is arm wrestling the devil to see if Hillary gets elected. I said, well, if those are what switched the election, the regular ad guys have been missing a whole lot of bets. I said, this is just a fantasy. They said, you don't like him, so you're making up a fantasy. Next thing you hear, he'll be telling us how he was born in Kenya.
So you don't think there's a big state that's pulling the strings and we only see the puppets?
I think there are a few guys who sort of try, but they're typically so incompetent. What does it mean to be Machiavellian when nothing you do actually works? There were Machiavellian people who were plotting us to get to invade Iraq. how did they gain from this? How did their side gain from what happened in that? I said, it didn't. I said, why? Because they're morons. The people at the top, most of them don't actually know very much, and let alone be good enough that they can, do triple bank shots and say, we'll support him, which will weaken this other guy so that, something else complicated happens. Mostly, they do things and stuff happens, but there isn't a whole lot of relationship. I mean, like Stalin, he was a manipulator. He was going to try to weaken the West and the Middle East, but he weakened the Soviet Union more because Jews were a significant part of the ruling class, and they developed an incurable alienation between him and them. It's hard, prediction is hard, but do we have guys who are trying to cause X to happen? I said, yeah, but that doesn't mean that's what happens necessarily.
Yeah, well, you had a few elites who completely transformed the Western world's view of same-sex marriage. I mean, that was not a populist bottom-up movement. That was a deliberate top-down movement by elites who pulled strings and
so
people
we're talking
changed
about
their fundamental
tops
values.
And bottoms already. I mean, really, that's one that's hard for me to understand, but it sort of happened. But I claim there was another thing that was probably at least as important that was very weird, that made people's attitudes towards homosexuality become much more favorable. So many of them dying from exercising it.
Because homosexuals were dying from AIDS.
People somehow ended up more approving of homosexuality. Yes.
That's insane. That could only happen if you got some elites who are pulling the strings saying we should feel sorry for these people who are flooding our country with a deadly disease.
No, it's not that. People can believe all sorts of strange things. They don't have to have any reason at all. Or if it is, it's not necessarily one to understand.
That was a deliberate top-down elite saying we've got to feel sorry for these people who hang around in bathhouses.
I know a lot of people who became sorry because it was somebody they knew dying. That's not purely top-down. I know it makes no sense, but if you start insisting that things make sense, you're going to have to stay in bed. A lot of things, they may make some sort of emotional sense. If we had a complete theory of psychology, we could predict them. But like once upon a time, there's a tribe in South Africa, the Xhosa. This is back around 1850. There was some girl said, I'm hearing these voices. These voices say, we should kill all our cattle and burn all the crops. And if we do, all our enemies, and they were surrounded by enemies, Boers, English, Zulus, they'll all go away and the gods will replace them with new and more beautiful cattle. So they did it. Now, who gained? I said, I don't know, about half the Xhosa starved to death. Why did they do it? People are funny. Now, was this the deep state of the Xhosa? By the way, there's a click in there I can't pronounce. I apologize. No, they're just a bunch of crazy people. Like, who gained from the Children's Crusade? I said, Ottoman slavers. Oh, no, not Ottoman. I guess they were proto-Ottoman, Turkish slavers. There's all kinds of things there was a time in which all the upper classes in Portugal, involving, by the way, many Jewish converts, conversos, new Christians, decided that the right thing to do was to send the entire army and the entire upper class, including those new Christians, to invade Morocco and conquer it. They were all killed. Why? Because they were crazy. And there was something in the air in those years that certain crazy ideas could propagate. I mean, the only people who gained out of this, even the Moroccans, they said, well, we lost a few people in the process of having to kill them all, and now they're all dead. So we can get there. This was not really, we beat them, but, it's not anything to write home about. But lots of people do things that are just crazy. It's an important part of the human spirit. You can't ignore it. I'm not saying that you can explain everything that way, but you always have to consider, what was the reason that Ottoman Sultan was nice to Venice? Because he was whipped by a particular young lady. Now, how easy is that to fit into our big theory of history? I said, it's hard. It means you have a lot of random shit happening, stuff that's even crazy. It's not everything, but it's always part of the story. Why do we do a lot of the things we do? I said, I mean, like if you were, being pro-gay, reduce the number of gays. If you had had a quarantine early in the AIDS years, you would have cut the number of people dying by probably half or more. Not all, because a lot of it was already started before we noticed what was going on. But for example, Fidel Castro did do this. He had quarantine. The per capita deaths in Cuba were 40 times lower than the United States.
If I never read a female scholar on anything to do with public policy, would I be impoverished?
Maybe not. Are we talking about feminists in particular, just anybody?
No, just a woman. Like if I think of the top 100 economists or the top 100 political scientists or the top 100 experts on Wall Street, I don't think I'd find a woman in those numbers.
There is another question, which is, would you lose anything by not reading the top 100 economists? Would you lose anything by not reading the top 100 political scientists?
Yes.
I'm not convinced. I personally try to have a little prediction contest running with a lot of the supposed experts, and I think I'm ahead, and I'm not even trying very hard. I predicted the fall of the Soviet Union. I don't remember the powers that be. By the way, only about 3 years in advance. I'm not trying to claim that I'm a seer. I thought that Saddam was going to invade Kuwait. I wasn't wrong about that. I thought if we got involved in Iraq, we'd find they had no weapons of mass destruction problem, and we'd end up fighting a local, Arab/Muslim guerrilla war. And I did pretty well compared to conventional wisdom, and I might point out on a much lower budget on the CIA, although I would be willing to change that if anybody wanted to fund me at the same level. I don't know that they know anything at all. We have... Oh, we have time?
I'm sorry, you keep going.
Well, it's your time, but I thought I could go on if you want. But wait, we have educational experts, all right? But are they ever right? Ever?
No, education, they're morons.
Well, I was making a list of some of the problems that the economists have had trouble with. I don't think economists were very successful in figuring out what was going on in the Soviet bloc. For example, standard economics texts by people like Paul Samuelson in 1989 were saying it's a vulgar error to think that you can't make one of these centralized systems work. Now, he may have been a kind of bad year to publish that particular edition, but many economists thought that, the sort of system in the Soviet Union, East Bloc, and so forth could be competitive. But why? Because, it's not like if they thought that in 1918, at least you could say they hadn't seen it much. But you could walk around East Berlin and notice they still had the bullet holes in all the sides of the walls from 1945. You could notice that they were driving cars that used lawnmower engines. The part where you mix in the oil with the gas, so you don't have to have this complicated lubrication system. And so you get blue smoke is coming out of the back every day. And of course, it is 25 horsepower. That makes up for it. Every fucking thing in the Soviet bloc was screwed. But could academic economists recognize it? On the whole, not very much. Or here's another one. There are parts of the world that are very poor, or fairly poor, and nobody seems to quite be able to say why. Why is sub-Saharan Africa poor? Or why is the Islamic world poor except for oil?
Stupid.
Well, pretty much. By the way, the Arab world actually has the opportunity to change part of this easily, which is not true in most places.
Cousin marriage, ending cousin marriage.
Stop marrying your cousin, and all those problems from inbreeding. If you marry somebody from another tribe, the problems in the next generation don't happen. It's gone. You fixed it. And it doesn't even
that's like 4 IQ points, right?
6 at least. And even it might be more in some places because sometimes it's more complicated than just first cousin. But the point is, it's free. There have been a few other places that found something they could do. One of them is iodine supplementation. There have been certain regions of the world that were really suffering, and then you have essentially a free, super cheap cure that the next generation is out from under. Bavaria used to be a place with a lot, in recent times, used to have a lot of goiter, and also you can lose more IQ points than just 6 from this. And it was actually as late as the 80s that they started doing iodized salt there, but it solved it. I mean, there have been other places boosted by this. Unfortunately, we don't know many things like this, quick improvements. But like one thing you do in Saudi Arabia is don't marry your cousin. I mean, there's a lot of other fish in the sea, really, but I don't see any movement on that. Well, actually, the movement I see is that Western intellectuals are more and more approving of cousin marriage, apparently since we now have very detailed genetic information for just how bad it is. They are approving it more. I mean, the real reason they approve it more is says, well, groups that hate the Western world do it, so we must approve of it, I think. I mean, I don't know what else it is.
If someone's got a spare $100,000, how would you recommend they invest it for maximum return?
Let me think, because I have about 3 or 4 candidates, each of which would turn the world inside out, but in a good way. Here's one. All right, assuming that I could get anywhere with 100,000, I'm not sure I could. Stopping cousin, if you could make a difference with 100,000, stopping cousin marriage would be a clear win. It wouldn't solve all the world's problems, but it would help some. Okay, there's one. Okay, but I don't think it's that likely to be workable. Okay, here's another. Now, this one takes more than 100,000, but it could be the seed. Are you familiar with the idea of self-replicating machines?
A little bit, vaguely.
Okay, suppose you build something. It has solar panels. It gets energy. It can process rock, separate it out into different elements and so forth, and use that to eventually make a copy of itself. Make one. Sit back and watch. And by the way, the ideal place would probably be something like the moon because, for one thing, you can build everything lighter because of low gravity. Anyhow, if you make something like this, you can eventually have something that covers the moon, for example. Geometric growth is very much faster than you think. It's like letting 2 rabbits loose in Australia.
Yeah. Well,
that's what they did. Actually, it was more like 10, but still, within 10 years, Australia had more rabbits. They couldn't get rid of them. No matter, they killed 2 million a year, and they were still increasing. Okay, if you could make something like this, and it could make useful things, it could make electricity, it could make parts for machines, it would give enormous wealth to whoever controls it. This is something that's technologically possible. Not easy. You take a lot of engineering, but there's no parts of it that we don't basically know how to do. There's no new physics required or anything. But you can't get anybody interested in it. The powers, like one of the qualities for the powers that be is not having too much imagination. If you did, they would catch you and you would never get promoted beyond a certain level. But this is possible. This is something that could change the world, probably in a better way. But there are other possibilities. If you can figure out any way to increase human intelligence, by the way, when I mentioned cousin marriage, that is a way, but it has kind of a limited ceiling. But there might be other ways. In principle, they could be very important. There are ways that are so simple. Like, what if you took a billionaire and he bribed smart people to marry each other? You could increase the number of smart kids in the next generation just by that, even if they didn't have any more than they planned to before. And again, this is a fact that is not a permissible fact. So, for example, there was a guy who tried to set up something called the Nobel Prize Sperm Bank years ago. He got very few Nobel Prizes for doing it, and I don't think they actually had any kids from it, probably because they only had 1 or 2 and the guy was too old. But they got a bunch of very accomplished people to donate. And there was a writer for Slate, of all places, who had a thought. He said, these things are kept secret. They don't release the information, and that's fair. He said, but they don't have to be secret. If people want to come and talk to me, they're allowed. So he just, in his magazine, he said, anybody you think is, the kids came from this, could I interview you? And some did. And guess what he found out about those kids, the very accomplished guys?
They were very accomplished.
Yeah, although I would still suspect that since the mothers, to do such an odd thing, there's a fair chance they were nuts. I wouldn't be surprised to see a little bit of that too. But on the whole, the kids were very accomplished. But the thing is, he writes for Slate. He knows that can't be true. You can't select on brains like the way for that matter, he probably doesn't think you can select for milk production in a Guernsey. He didn't grow up on a farm. He's never even known anybody who grew up on a farm. Those are mysterious guys with guns out in the countryside. Anyhow, there is nobody more averse to not averse to every possible implementation, averse to the facts themselves than typical American Jews are probably completely averse to the actual facts of how inheritance works. Only that doesn't mean they always reject it in their personal lives. Beliefs can mean many things, but sometimes it does. It's a strange thing. But as I said, there are people running it. Like, I know people in Israel I talked to who said, well, the official view was we could bring in people from anyone and they would soon assimilate to whatever the highest levels are in Israel. I said, but they don't. He said, yeah, I know that. I said, but you could have known that in advance. He said, yeah, I know that too, but they don't. And they're not about to admit it because it's emotionally important to them. And we hear this a lot. But anyhow, in this experiment showed that something is possible that according to the general intelligence of the United States is not possible. You can't breed for intelligence. The answer is, of course you can. It's easy. Nobody does it systematically. And I can think of no human population where it was done deliberately. Like, with the Ashkenazi Jews, if it's wealth selection, like I'm thinking, it just happened. And why did they fall into that job description? I said, well, one, the religion fostered literacy. If you were a good rabbinical Jew, you were supposed to be able to read. When you move to a new place, farming is the hardest thing to get into because everybody else already has a farm. Some sort of commerce or something is not so hard to get into. But it's hard to move somewhere else and get a farm. What else? They had a rule against intermarriage. If there had been much intermarriage, this couldn't have happened. Said you have to have the right preconditions. They're fairly unusual. Usually when two groups become different over time, the isolation is because they're physically far apart. But in certain cases, where a group is a caste, where they have very low intermarriage, and if they do something different, like I claim if the Jews had been a group of people who farmed in Germany and Poland, they wouldn't have been all that different from their neighbors over time. They would have been farmers, not wildly different. But, they're doing something different. It's at least possible they'll become different. Was this rule designed in order for the Jews to genetically engineer themselves? I said, of course not. I mean, for one thing, there's no group that knows less about breeding farm animals than this. By the time that they were a commercial caste, by the way, suppose you had talked to a knight, a Norman, in the year 900 or 1000 and said, well, we're going to breed people to be smarter or stronger. He would have said, yeah, I know how to do that, just like I do with my horses. He would have understood it. He might have said, oh, I don't know. I mean, who cares how smart you are? Or he might have said, we're going to have to it would be hard to make people do this for a long time. He might have had a lot of reasonable, because I know of no evidence anybody's ever done this on purpose. They might someday. It would work. But I know of no evidence anybody ever did. And there's many examples people said, well, doesn't this do it? Like they're talking about the Chinese examination system. But I know how many people passed. And if it's only 1 in 10,000, it's hard to have a really big effect in a mere 1,000 years. It didn't have much effect. And the other question is, like I said, but Koreans are pretty smart too. They didn't do any of that. And Japanese. So why do I need different explanations for each group? And the answer is, well, probably you don't, and this isn't the explanation. But at any rate, there's all sorts of basic facts, some of which are now coming up with genetic engineering and stuff, which if you are a good liberal arts major who went to an Ivy League school and worked for a big paper or in the Senate or in a bureaucracy, they're just not true. But you're wrong. Suppose there was a country. You were talking about maybe China will do such things. What if they or some other country did? And they did it fairly seriously. So you end up with a country out there that average IQ of 130. That would be pretty. It's not impossible. There are individuals like that. You could make that the new average. I think we'd be really reluctant to admit it. We'd probably see all sorts of articles saying, well, that's not real intelligence, blah, 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 blah. There'd be no end to it. And people would make up stories about it. Or they say, well, there's a principle that says you can't select for things that are affected by many genes. And I said, but you made that up. I mean, you can. just like you can select for height. Like, did you know that the children of people in the NBA are taller than average? And in fact, so much so that their chance of actually getting into the NBA is, it's not huge, but it's far bigger than a random person. I mean, far better than a random black guy. If your dad married somebody from the WNBA, which might actually be kind of a trick. You're supposed to laugh. But if you did, the chances would be far higher.
Yeah. Is there anything that I can do to increase my IQ?
What's the stupidest thing you're doing? Well, let me think.
Aside from abstaining from doing stupid things.
Not that I can think of, but it's conceivable somebody will find a way at some point, but I don't know of any right now. I mean, people talk about, do pill X have some effect? I know of no such pill in which there was careful research that shows that it really does.
Okay, so here's
what are you holding?
modafinil.
I can't quite read it.
Yes, modafinil. So I had a sleepless night last night.
Oh, I've heard of that, yes.
I got up at 5:30 a.m. I popped a modafinil. So prior to this interview, I did 12 hours of cognitive work. And now it's 16 hours since I got up and took a modafinil. So with modafinil, I can do 16 hours of cognitive work in a day. Without modafinil, I can do about 8 hours. So to me, this just completely changed my life.
Well, but here's a question. And I've heard people say things like, I don't know anything personally about it. I haven't seen careful studies and I've never tried it. But here's a question. Do you come up with the ideas you really, remember as I really knocked the park out with that one? Does it affect the rate of that? Just asking. I don't have a feeling.
It reduces my creativity. It enhances my ability it enhances my desire to read and to study.
Fair enough. And the point is, the existence of a trade-off like that is not it's not totally ridiculous. But the trade-off we're really looking, you see, the idea is that if something if it's just purely good, maybe that would have already happened. But life is full of trade-offs. It's very easy to have something that makes you better at X and worse at Y. The question is, if you can make Y something you don't care about. So you want the ideal IQ boosting drug we would find is one that makes you lose weight. You see, because through most of history, if something that made you lose weight would actually be sort of dangerous. The famine comes and you're in worse shape. But Americans, being the fattest people in history, as far as I know, if we could find something, it boosts your IQ, but unfortunately it increases your calorie use, which again, for most of history would have been a bad thing. Now there we'd have a win-win, and you'd actually make money, probably more on the side of losing weight than you would on actually making people smarter. But the point is, that's something that's conceptually possible because it's a trade. Trade-offs are more reasonable. Just getting suddenly a lot better at something with no side effects is sort of unlikely. If it was that easy, why didn't we already do it? Basically, whereas you can see, if the cost of being smarter was that you had to eat an extra 1,000 calories a day, most of history it wouldn't have worked, etc. By the way, I don't actually know if this exists, but if it did, I'd eat some too. But there are interesting questions about the intersection of smarts and creativity. I've known people who were really smart and they just didn't have new ideas. I mean, I also know people have lots and lots of ideas, 80% of which are crap. I would put myself in that category. 90%, 93%. But the point is, sometimes the other part, it's nice to do it. Sometimes it's useful. But I know other people, they tried and they just couldn't. And, the sort of people who would do the New York Times crossword puzzle in ink, fast, but new ideas, not hardly, really. It was, I don't think we understand everything there is to understand about this. Or there are groups of people that they seem pretty smart, but new ideas are not very common. Again, Ashkenazi Jews have often come up with new ideas. Some of them weren't even crazy. Some of them, I would not say they have come up with ideas that were both crazier and more true than any non-Jewish guy. Probably Gödel has the record for the craziest true idea of the 20th century, which is finding out that you can never prove that mathematics is perfectly self-consistent. He was, and by the way, he really was crazy. Some of the most interesting ideas come out of people who need a keeper, and some from other people who are pretty reasonable. But Ashkenazi Jews have had plenty of crazy ideas. They can hold up their head high, and even some of them were good crazy ideas. They are overrepresented in that area. Unfortunately, they're at least as overrepresented in powerful bad new ideas, unfortunately. Like any given time, you hear about somebody starting a new cult. There's a fair chance that he's either Ashkenazi or that most of the members are. I mean, the Bhagwan had, an enormous number of Ashkenazi Jews in his commune who were busy plotting to do food poisoning to the local. I mean, that was a weird group. Creative, though, except all in a bad way. I mean, you're not too surprised if the local American Nazi leader is Ashkenazi. That happened in Skokie. Yeah. I mean, like here would be like there's certainly sometimes a tendency to claim people as Jewish or not Jewish according to, by the way, and everybody else does this too. He's really one of us. This guy did this great or horrible thing. Anyhow, my most interesting example, which I haven't seen people touch much, there was a guy generally considered the best German general of World War II, von Manstein.
Yes.
But you know what his actual birth name was? No. See, he was adopted because there was a general who was both his father and this other guy were Prussian generals, and this other his father had like 9 kids, and this other Prussian general couldn't have any kids. They said, "Well, could we adopt? You got so many, and we like your kids, and we like you, and we'll treat him right, and he'll inherit the title, blah, blah, blah. So he'll be von Manstein instead of Lewinsky."
Wow.
No, he was only a little bit Jewish, and he would occasionally joke about it when he was in Russia exterminating Jews. But he's also probably the most talented army general of World War II. He's the guy who came up with the plan to send the tank army through and cut through to the coast.
Yes.
And many another thing. He could win when no one could win. But he couldn't win when there's a million trillion Russians coming at him. But yeah, he's not a very respectable dude. But he was good.
What was not respectable about him?
He collaborated closely with the Einsatzgruppen. I'd call that unrespectable. Of course, most German generals did. Not all, but most. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Where do you get your inspiration?
I don't know. I mean, there's certainly guys I read about their work and I said, boy, I hope someday I can do something as cool as that, although I sincerely doubt it. There's certainly lots of people I admire. And some of them I've even met. And some of them I tried to learn a lesson or two. So like something else, be a realistic, keep it simple. Look for the simplest explanation that works. What about the politics of it? Screw it. Who cares?
What about music?
Well, now we're moving all the way to right field as opposed to left field. I like some kinds of music, fairly wide spectrum. I mean, everything from Bach to Finnish bluegrass doing AC/DC.
But what type of music is most likely to make you cry?
I can't remember the last time music really made me cry. Probably if it did, I wouldn't listen to it that much. I understand what you're talking about, but that's probably not my favorite kind. But I suppose if I was drunk or something, Tchaikovsky could make me cry, but I can't remember the last time it actually did. I like Tchaikovsky. There's a certain sadness in the music, but I don't remember it ever making me cry.
What about cats playing with string?
Yes. Is this
an actual? Does that inspire you? Does that make you happy? Like animals frolicking?
No, but I do have some animal stories for you, although they are not connected to cats and string. We have a dog that has learned to say a couple of words. He says hello. Not very well. It's hello. He usually does it when you've been gone for a few hours. You come back in the front door. He goes and says hello. All right, he also says something which is crappier, but he's probably trying to say, I love you, since we say that to him all the time. That's about as far as it goes, though. However, most people think that that means we're hallucinating. But no, once in a rare time, you have a dog that can do a couple of things like that. There's actually people who have worked at it, who have got them to do, crappy versions of more words than just two. Of course, the other thing is we were trying, let's see if this experiment works. If people listen to this, we will see if it works. You see, you were talking about IQ boosting substances, for example. Okay? All right. My daughter was a National Merit finalist. My oldest boy didn't quite make that, but he was a Regent Scholar at the local university and got a free ride. The next boy was a National Merit finalist. Of my twins, one of them was a National Merit finalist. So 3 out of 5. Normally it's, about 0.5% get it. And then we have a dog that talks. And then and a cat has been known to talk once or twice too, which is perhaps even stranger. Cats are kind of dumb. Okay, so we are working on building the myth that it's something in the cookies my wife makes. And those cookies are not free. But what it really is heredity is a fairly strong force. And which, again, I don't know how much people really believe it in terms of truly believing it, but the official doctrine is that it's not true. And that you wouldn't expect to see, like in a small town, most of the academic awards concentrated in 2 or 3 families. But you do. It would be interesting. Again, I don't know how much people really believe these things. Go ahead, your turn.
Have you ever been to Yosemite?
Yeah.
Did you find it inspiring?
Interesting. I don't know about really inspiring. What I mainly felt at the time, and this is my fault, not theirs, is there's some people, at the time I'd been living around near LA. I was a sea level person, and some people take altitude better than others when they suddenly move up, and I am not one of them. What I felt was a headache most of the time I was there, which probably decreased my enjoyment. But I don't blame Yosemite for this. But it's spectacular. It's interesting. But I have to say, I felt crappy most of the time I was there. I had the same trouble once when I went to a conference at Aspen.
Yeah.
I mean, and there I was used to Albuquerque, which is about a mile high, but they're about 10,000 feet, and I was just pooped. I could have gotten used to it, but it would have taken longer than the conference.
I had the same experience. Is there any physical landscape that has had the most emotional effect on you?
Lots of flat cornfields where I grew up. That's the way the world should look. I remember a friend from the same area. He was going to Colorado, and they were driving, without stop, changing drivers over some holiday. And he woke up, and he was in Garden of the Gods National Park, and he had never seen a mountain in his life. He'd grown up in East Central Illinois, where, like in the county I grew up in, there was a boulder about 4 feet high left in somebody's field. People talked about it as a landmark because it was a rock. You could think that the earth was not even made out of rocks because all you saw was living things and dirt. At any rate, he got to that park and he woke up and he looked, his first reaction was, you couldn't grow corn here to save your life. That's probably close to my attitude. But I'm used to it now. I was out hiking in the Sandias yesterday, which is one reason every part of my body hurts after going up a trail for 6 hours. I could be in better shape.
How does a cornfield make you feel?
At home. Sort of. Not that I see it very often, but at least I understand it. And see, I had a wrong idea when I grew up. I thought people did comprehensible and useful things. There was a factory town not too far away, which, by the way, we don't seem to have many of left anymore. But it was a factory town. Some people I knew worked at the Firestone plant. Some worked at the Caterpillar plant. Some people made tires. Most of the people I knew in town seemed to do something useful. It gave me a completely wrong idea about how the country worked even then. And it's far more, what I think people define, what fraction of jobs are basically just bullshit. And if everybody stopped doing them, we'd all be a little better off. It's got to be at least half.
Is there anything that you'd like to talk about that we haven't raised?
No, I think well, there are, but, I mean, if your ears fell off, it would probably be bad for your program, wouldn't it? I have many other things that interest me. I mean, as you must have noticed, I can get excited talking about logistics for German tank divisions, as well as science fiction-y things like self-reproducing machines, or I could have talked about the birth of the Indo-Europeans if we'd wanted to bring that up, but that's for another time. But no, this is enough. I mean, on the Ashkenazi story, what I think, and I could be wrong, but what I think is they're an unusual example of a group that was isolated by social customs, that was partly because of their history and customs and partly because of chance. They fell into a situation with an unusual mix of jobs, and they were staying there long enough that they changed some. And that has happened to other groups, but on different ways. Like Tibetans are better at putting up with altitude than you ever will be. We know that. We know some of the molecular things. We know that, well, here's an odd one. There's this group of people who live on the ocean all the time in Southeast Asia, in little houseboats and things. It turns out they're better at deep diving than anybody else. I mean, they'll dive down to 200 feet, which free diving, and that's remarkable. I mean, crazy even. No normal person can do that. I mean, that's about their limit, but that limit is 50 feet lower than anybody else. And they'll stay down there for minutes that would kill anybody else. They've changed. Lots of people have changed to adjust to different diets. People have changed to adjust to different diseases. Lots of people in the malaria parts of the world have various things like sickle cell and a number of other things that they're still there, even if you get rid of the malaria. So it's left a mark. There are many things like that. In our book, what we argue says, well, people really, every new environment, you start changing in a way that eventually you fit it better. Everything. Or the way I put it is, every society selects for something. I mean, right now our society is selecting for being immune to certain kinds of bullshit. And clearly that selection hasn't gone very far yet. But suppose you had somebody who said, well, I know all the things I'm supposed to think, but I'm thinking something that somehow lets me survive, make a living, and raise a family. Those things are going to be more common in the next generation. Unfortunately, it takes a long time to get a lot of change. So we may have to have civilization fall for a couple of thousand years before we get this all straightened out, if in fact we ever do. But yeah, everybody's changed. Eskimos have changed. They're better at digesting a diet that's very high in fats. They're also better at surviving, I know this is a shock, in cold weather. Hey, but there were people not long ago who would have said, oh no, there's been no evolution. Humans have stopped evolving. They stopped evolving 50,000 years ago. And some of them actually meant it. Others were just lying. But it makes no sense. And it's not the case.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed our interview. Thank you so much for giving us spending this time with us.
Well, I hope you found it useful or interesting.
Yes, very much.
Okay, well, take care.
Take care. Thank you so much, Dr. Greg Cochran. Thank you.
Okay.
Halsey, thank you so much for your generosity making this conversation possible. Any final words from you, Halsey English?
No, I really, really enjoyed that. So,
well, thank you.
It was great to hear, and I learned a lot. So, thanks.
Well, if someday you guys want to talk about something completely different, I might have something to say.
Fantastic.
I have someone who wants to do a debate with you. Actually, not like a hostile debate, but
on what?
She's been commenting on a lot of your articles.
Oh, who's this?
Her name is CV.
I don't think I think I need to know more. What is her point of view? Can you say?
Yeah, sure. She said that she would actually challenge you on. Let me get the wording correctly so I don't throw it off.
She's a communist.
Yeah, she's a bit of a communist, but at the same time, she doesn't want to argue politics. She wants to argue that IQ is not a hereditary trait among racial lines.
Well, it could be that it's a vast conspiracy with everybody on Earth has been acting their part in a way that just looks like that for the past few thousand years. I can believe that. Not very easily, but
in genetics, I believe. So it wouldn't be just a.
It would be unfair because I actually talked to the people doing the recent surveys and know exactly where the state of the art is, and she probably does not. And it's actually hard to argue with people when you know the scientific facts and they just don't. You see what I mean? If I was trying to argue about string theory with somebody, look, I wouldn't feel like I knew enough to say anything, but there are other people who know so much less that I couldn't really argue with them because they'd say, what's string theory, right? I mean, I might say, I have my doubts. It's maybe too abstract and it's not connected enough to experiment, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, you need a common ground. Although I guess we could always talk about Kurapati Forest, because that is where they had one of the execution places in Stalin back in the 30s, and people who were going out for hunt for mushrooms would hear this crunching sound of the bones underneath their feet. And, you know, you can't get much more communist than that.
I don't think she's a commie like that. She's more of just a collectivist.
Well, all you have to do is come up with a fair number of examples. Like, for example, let's suppose somebody said, well, I'm going to find all the unsung geniuses in Group X. And even though they score poorly in IQ tests, they start doing really hot shit stuff. They solve problem A. They solve problem B. They cured cancer. They, you know, kept teenagers from being bored. All right, I said, what would I say? I said, fuck IQ tests. More power to you. You know, you got the job done. That's all I care about. I said, it's a little surprising to me that you could do that when your scores were 80 because no one else ever could. But hey, if you do it, you did it. All right. She can convince me anytime that happens. I'll give in instantly. All you have to do is perform. Like if I had a guy who was 4'3" and he could consistently, you know, make 30 points a game in the NBA, I'd shake his fucking hand. I don't care. But there are no examples of this. What's she got to do? Say there ought to be examples? I said, well, it'd be nice. But where are they? There are none. None. Zero. Doesn't happen that way.
And this she is a transsexual. Do you think transsexualism is a mental illness?
Of course. Would that help? But by the way, having a given mental illness does not necessarily make you right or wrong on another particular technical question. Although I must say, there's a general tendency to just be goofier in general. Schizophrenia is not a royal road to being a professional scientist. But, yeah, of course it's a mental illness. I mean, by the way, there's a simple way to define it. You talk about what is a Darwinian mental illness? It's a behavior pattern that would never have worked in a reproductive sense in the past. Now, I claim that cutting off your balls has always had reproductive penalties associated with it.
Hey, that's the perfect way to end the show.
You're free.
Thank you
be
so
in touch.
much.
We'll see if we can set it up. I'll make sure that
I will have to think about it, but this person sounds perhaps confused. Take care.
Thank you so much
for coming, Dr. Cochran. We really appreciate it.
Dr. Greg Cochran, and thank you, Halsey English, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.